election will be in January July of this year. The number one issue is that he's being accused of being too close to the Liberals. So that they're actually, the people running against him are saying, hey, you're supposed to be an advocacy organization, you're supposed to be fighting for us, and here you are negotiating and talking quietly, et cetera, et cetera. So, sorry? Yeah, absolutely. We talked about that the other day on the education file when he, John Atleo, national chief, negotiated a $2.5 billion increase in education spending, and to his horror and to the horror of the government of Canada, the chiefs turned it down and basically kicked him out of office. So it's a really interesting relationship because it's not a political party, it's not a parliament, it's not a democratically elected organization. Watch the thing this summer when they have the actual election, and watch if you can. Not very many commentators cover it very extensively, but you have to watch a couple of things. Manitoba tends to be outliers. The Manitoba Chiefs tend to be very assertive. They're sort of a tacky Alfred kind of approach. Very, we're independent-minded. We'll do whatever we want. Ontario Chiefs tend to be very political. And so you'll watch the election going along and it's really close, and all of a sudden, whoosh, one person surges forward in the voting. And it's because the Ontario Chiefs have sort of got together and said, okay, this is the person we want. That's exactly what happens in the Liberal Party and the NDP and the Conservatives and all that sort of thing. Anybody on the phone with us? Shoot. I'm sorry. I was being really happy with all of the wonderful way the technology was serving us so far. Anybody else have any other thoughts and issues?
Well, I know those guys aren't really here yet, but it sort of goes with the AFN and the idea, because those chiefs are all of communities, and communities tend to be remote and rural, or so many of them are. And so for me, it's about the urban Aboriginal population and where are we going with that, because that's going to play into, that's the biggest population, and that could be a problem if we don't start making steps now.
And I don't want to talk too much about these individuals. These are great questions, some of which we're going to talk about a little bit, but this is really, really helpful for me, is that there's a lot of First Nations in the country who do not want urban Aboriginal folks represented in their councils. They basically say, here's the argument you hear many, many times. If our culture and our community are going to survive, they're going to survive because they're attached to the reserve. The only chance we have for them to survive. So if the resources start going off reserve, and you're starting taking housing allocations and post-secondary allocations and social service allocations, and actually putting it into people who are living off reserve, then somebody there? Wonderful. Who's that?
Yeah,
Who's there?
I think it's Candace.
Was that Candace?
Candace, it's Candace.
Wonderful, Candace. Anybody else there?
Yes.
Who's that? Anybody else? Well, Candace is better than nobody. Candace, great to have you.
You're trying to shake out a WebEx person.
Well, I can hear somebody.
Oh, there's someone.
Who's there?
This is Brad, but I can't see anybody here. I don't know why.
Oh, we see
Quinn's
you.
here.
There we go. We can see you now.
Hey, I'm also there.
Okay, who's that?
Quinn's
here.
Quinn's here. Okay, we're more or less getting everybody.
Prab.
Thank you. Anybody we're missing?
Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. Sorry, folks. My fault. We didn't send the WebEx notice out.
Are you there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, he's also there now.
Is he there now?
Oh, I can see you.
Okay.
I think, yeah.
Now we can watch Jocelyn do her exercises. That's the only camera we have on Jocelyn. We were stretching. It looks like we were about to break into aerobics class. So we can see
Hello,
them.
Ken.
Oh, but we can. What are you looking at, Brad? Can you see the whole class?
Oh, I can see everybody now. It's all good.
Okay, so this one on the right doesn't matter. Don't worry about it. Okay.
Was,
Amy,
was
you
all
saved
the
the day. Thank
confusion
you, thank you,
because
thank you.
question I asked?
Thank you very much. We appreciate that.
I have a question.
Yep.
So how is the situation in the United States? How are they dealing with things?
Oh boy. Okay. Well, we are going to have a session about the United States. It's interesting. Do you notice the importance of the Aboriginal issue in the American election last year? Did you follow that at all? The debates that were going on and the arguments going forward? There was nothing. There was absolutely nothing at all. And that's a.
Elizabeth May. Not Elizabeth May, sorry. Elizabeth Warren.
Yes, yeah.
That was the only thing.
Elizabeth Warren is a potential presidential Democratic candidate. When she became a faculty member at the University of Harvard University, she ticked a box that said she was a Native American. Nobody can find her ancestry. She sort of said, well, it's just a chance to meet interesting people. Other people, the Republicans, who Donald Trump refers to her as Pocahontas, which is an insulting thing to do, and essentially says that she did this to get a job. Now, Elizabeth Warren is actually a really impressive person. She was going to get a job at Harvard anyway, but it's become this sort of, if she was to become the presidential candidate, you would see an anti-American Indian movement of the highest order. So we'll come back to that one because it's interesting. Folks on WebEx, just so you know, while we were waiting, I told them all about the final exam, the marking scheme, and the assignment. I'm just kidding. We didn't talk about that at all. What we were doing was just... poor Brad, we're going to get him this. What I was doing was just saying that I've been receiving some really good comments and thoughts from people about subjects they want to make sure we cover in the course. So I've got a whole list of things. People have raised the following so far, that we look specifically at health and health administration. Health administration, by the way, is probably the greatest number of success stories in Aboriginal self-government, where they've actually taken control of their own health systems and have actually, in places like northern Manitoba, included Aboriginal health and Aboriginal health workers, meaning in the healthcare system. They've actually done some interesting things. So we'll talk about health, issues of women, Aboriginal women, economic development partnership agreements, municipalities, what's new about the Trudeau government, the role of the Assembly of First Nations, urban Aboriginals, and American sort of comparative situations. So realize we can't cover everything in as much detail as we might like to, but those WebEx folks, please, either over the course of today's class or later, just send me a note or just speak up as you go along and tell me the topics and subjects that you'd like to see us cover in the class. We won't obviously get to absolutely everything in the same level of detail, but if we can at least touch on things that you're really interested in, that really, really helps me a lot, sort of knowing where you want to see these things go. So that's sort of catches us up to where we are now. Had a very interesting conversation. Remember I mentioned yesterday the survey that has come out? So this is the survey, it's the Angus Reid survey on Canadian attitudes toward Aboriginal folks. It's not being released until the end of the month. So when I get it, I'll just send it out to our email list. You can sort of look at it. Very interesting, very thoughtful journalist. Those words do not always go together. Sometimes they just don't have time. But the Maclean's magazine tends to give its authors a fair amount of time. And this fellow was really worried about sort of what he was reading in there. And he sort of told me more of the stuff, more of the sort of preliminary results that have come out. And we were able to tell him some of the things we've talked about urban-rural sort of situations, some of the issues around New Canadians and things like that. And the results essentially are showing that the survey is suggesting that the Trudeau government will take a real hit politically for standing up for Aboriginal rights, which is what's happened every other time a political party has really stood up prominently for Aboriginal rights. And it's like, come off it, right? At this day and age. One of the things a bunch of us are doing, and I say behind closed doors, is to sort of trying to put pressure on I work for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute as well, a public policy think tank based in Montreal, based in Ottawa, and we have conversations with all political parties and government folks and whatever. We're really pushing hard to get people to depoliticize Aboriginal rights.
Ken?
Yes? Go ahead.
It's like you're cutting out. So I'm not sure if it's my system or if it's your system, but you keep cutting out.
Others on WebEx, am I cutting out?
Me too. Yeah, you are quite a bit.
Oh, we'll try a different mic.
Yeah.
It doesn't break green. We'll try. We're going to try a different mic. Thank you very much. Does that make a difference?
I think it might be this. I think it might be the connection though, because my camera freezes on the room as well.
Oh boy. Shirley will be coming in soon, and when we take a break, we'll actually reboot and try this again. So my apologies. 4 good days of.
So, Ken, are we looking at the screen or are you looking at you?
Whoa! What was that?
I said, are we going to be looking at the screen or are we going to be looking at you? Because I'd prefer to look at you than look at the screen. All I see is yes on the screen.
Oh, is it okay? You're not getting the other side.
We have 2 screens. We can see Ken also.
Oh, some of you can see us?
Yeah.
Yeah, I have 2 screens.
Yeah. Me also.
Hey guys. Oh yeah, you can do whatever the hell you want. You're on vacation, Kelly. You decide.
Oh, he's talking to his kids. All right. Gosh. Don't really know what to do here. So, Jocelyn, you had something to say?
I'm just wondering, like today's topic, we're talking about nurses.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Yep.
Urban reserve creation, that's a trend. That seems to be a viable avenue for.
Can anyone hear me?
But also.
Can anyone hear Quinn?
Yes.
Money and how it hinders economic development for press.
What?
Oh. Yep. So, Jocelyn's comment was
hear
we should talk about, and you'll be happy, that's actually what the whole lecture today is about, economic development more generally, and the resource piece is part of it. There's some interesting things for you to read.
That's something important to say.
And also to talk about urban reserves. Jocelyn was suggesting a very interesting and important issue, and the constraints of the Indian Act, which are far more formidable than people think. Aboriginal folks have billions of dollars sitting in Ottawa, and if you want to spend it, they actually have to apply for permission to spend it. It's like a kindergarten or a high school kid who's got money sitting in their trust fund, and they have to get the government to say yes. Sometimes it can take months.
Or to the secret lake that we've got to find today.
So Quinn, we're enjoying your conversation.
Or to the morale picking spot.
Okay, so doesn't always work well. Yeah, that's a good idea. You guys want to all sign off and sign back in again? We'll see if we can get a better connection. Can you try that? Because we're getting all sorts of mangly stuff here.
Yeah, sure, Ken. I will sign off, and before I do, if it was me asking tonight that caused all this problems, I apologize.
It's not you in the slightest. It's problems at our end. Don't worry. And as soon as you said, before I sign off, you didn't stop talking for 10 seconds. So we could cut out. So shut everybody off and we'll try again.
Oh.
Everybody can disconnect and reconnect. The joys of modern technology. This is one of the reasons why when people tell you, well, you want to do remote surgery based on internet connections, you should pause a little bit. Like, okay, remember that class? We'll take the wrong kidney out.
Ken, it's Gail. Maybe what you can do is make sure everybody has their speakers, their microphones muted on WebEx, and it'll probably come in a lot clearer.
Yeah, okay, but can you all sign off, then we'll sign back on? Thanks, Gail.
Yeah, I did.
You're back on again. Because you're coming in very nicely. Any other WebExers on there?
Yeah, I'm there.
Who's that? Okay, you're here, but very, very quiet. Oh, there we got Brad. That's 3 on. You're here,
now
Brad.
I see the screen.
Oh,
Wow, I look bad.
Yeah,
Oh, that's better. It's a little bit louder.
it's better than before. Yeah,
Yeah, that's
it's
good.
good.
Thank you for the suggestion.
Yeah.
Okay, Quinn, are you there? Okay, we saw the top of somebody's head. Whose head was that? No, we already got your whole head. You're okay, Brad.
It's very delayed. Hello?
Yeah, it is. Oh, there we go. Candace, are you there, Candace? And can you hear us clearly?
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, we're getting better now. That's better.
Yeah, I guess everybody.
Yes, I am.
So we're missing
Yeah.
Quinn. Just trying to see if anybody's. All right. Well, we'll hope Quinn will join us in due course. He may already be there. Quinn, are you there? So this is sort of a side piece, but it'll be a good bridge as we wait to make sure everybody connects up. And welcome everybody on WebEx, and apologies for the problems getting signed up. It was my fault this morning not getting the things done correctly. I just wanted to tell a really quick story that I was talking to a friend of mine this morning who's a very prominent Aboriginal business leader, and he was really interested. We're taking this class, doing this class, and so wanted to know what we were talking about. And I said, so I told him about the class and how it's going, and I said, well, what story would you tell them if you were sitting in the classroom? What story would you sort of want to share with them that would sort of explain what's going on in your community and your life and your family sort of history, which is kind of an interesting segue from my point of view to sort of figure out what's actually happening to him and to his family and sort of how things developed. So his story is really interesting. From Northern Ontario, lives on a lake, for First Nations on a lake in Northern Ontario, and he's a very avid hunter fisher. Lives on the land still, spends a lot of time out hunting and fishing whenever he gets back from his business thing. So the story, he said, well, tell them what happened to our community. So in 1952. They had a First Nation reserve that was on this lake. And apparently, he says, it's a beautiful place. He's shown me pictures before, usually with a moose head in his arm or a couple of big fish. So the scenery is kind of hard to pick out. But he's a beautiful lake. And when they set up the reserves in that area, they had not really made a whole bunch of them into reserves. Some of them were basically leases from the government of Ontario. They were Ontario, remember, provinces own the land. The government of Ontario leased them a chunk of land. And the government of Ontario, it cost $17 a year. The federal government paid $17 a year to the government of Ontario, and they got this lease of land. People had lived there for, by this time, sort of close to, well, they lived there, this was their ancestral home, but they lived there as a reserve for pretty close to 100 years. And in 1952, the provincial government of Ontario looked at the community and said, this actually is a really beautiful spot. We're going to make this into a provincial park. So they actually decommissioned the reserve, which they could do just by canceling the license. It was an annual return on the road. So this is not a reserve under the federal government. But the Aboriginal folks didn't necessarily know this. Other stuff was happening behind closed doors. It didn't matter to them. And so what happened in 1952 was they decided they would actually convert their land into a provincial park, and they forced everybody out. The only thing they moved was the church. The church was physically relocated to a different site, to another First Nation where they thought these two communities could just get together and live together. They burned down their houses, tore all their houses down, and then burned them all up and all that sort of thing. And basically, they were all forced to leave. It stayed a provincial park until 1989. So there's a sort of 35, 36, 37-year history of fighting to get that park back, trying to get their land back. And it was decommissioned as a park in 1989, and they got reserve status in 2009. So they had a reserve, successful community. They were hunting, fishing, trapping, very traditional lifestyle. Government takes the reserve away, burns everything down, gives up the park. A lot of agitation going on behind the scenes. The communities not wanting it back, right? And in 2009, they got the reserve status back. So interestingly, just now, like really almost this month, this summer, they're in the process of implementing a community plan to actually have the community take back control of the reserve. So they actually be able to go back there. So you look at that and you think, this is kind of awful. Now, remember, this also happened to people who were on, there's Quinn, morning. This also happened to people who were involved with flooding, non-Aboriginal people. So in our family, our family's been flooded out twice. On 2 different occasions, the government built hydro dams in British Columbia. In both cases, they expropriated the land. People were forced off. In one case, they used it. In another case, they didn't use it. And we were never able to get, the family never able to get the land back. But in this case, they got it back. So you're looking at this story and thinking, okay, this is yet another one, another example, but it's his example of something that happened. And he said, here's the problem that he wrestles with. And he really feels very strongly about this. He said, because we were forced off the reserve, our people scattered. They do not live on a reserve. They do not have that reserve experience of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And one of the things I've been trying to sort of get across to you in the class so far is that 50s, 60s, 70s experience was really, really the part where many of the socioeconomic, cultural ills that we see today, yes, they can be traced back to the Indian Act and to residential schools and reserves and all that sort of stuff. Where it really hit home was in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So their community was scattered. And he says, if you look at our communities, 350 people altogether who sort of now identify with the community, he said, we actually got kind of lucky. Because we sort of never stopped being Aboriginal. We're still status Indians. But we had to go and live in different places. He was raised in Thunder Bay and went to regular schools. Parents had jobs in the forest sector and in the industrial sector. They actually had a prosperous sort of middle-class Canadian life. And he said, what I really wrestle with as we start reestablishing the reserve is that all the other First Nations in the immediate area who stayed on the reserves, didn't have their land taken away, have much poorer social and economic outcomes than their community, which was dispersed. And they're sort of looking and saying, okay, as we come back together, as we have the right to come back together, how do we make sure we don't go down that other path, which is a path of 30, 40, 50 years of dependency and all those sorts of things. And I was reflecting as he was talking about it, another friend in British Columbia who they're actually, this is one of the great history graduate projects you'll ever imagine. One of my students a long time ago basically did a study to show that a particular group of First Nations people in British Columbia should have been given band status, and they weren't. And they actually used the work that he did to actually regain band status. So they now have a band that's in the Lower Mainland. There's 150 of them. They were a community. They were sort of spread apart and broken up into pieces, and then but they still held together in a social way. It's not a huge distributed area. They say exactly the same thing. They say, well, what do you think about that? I say, wow, we got lucky. Because the ones who did get reserve status, the control of the Indian agent, the missionaries, the housing collaborations, the sort of dependency sort of culture, their group, they didn't have a reserve. So they became active fishermen. They were very involved in the sort of the other economy, but they stayed and maintained their indigenous contacts and connections. So it's very interesting just to sort of remind us about the sort of the mixed blessings of reserves in one sense, right? Imagine having it taken away and your houses burned down and all the churches moved away and that kind of stuff. That's pretty awful. Happens to every community. Whenever any community happens to, it's really disruptive. Anyway, so just a thought for the day. To sort of realize that this is the kind of life and experience that this fellow had as they went along. So this morning, before we take a break, I'm going to go through a couple of things, Nunavut first, and then one of our sort of in-class conversations that I think will get us started along the line that Jocelyn and several others were asking about the sort of the nature of the economic development. And for the class discussion piece, I really want you to actually talk amongst yourselves and share with all of us your thoughts about the role of government in economic development. And this is partly a way of teasing out your own philosophies and finding out what your own value systems are about the role of government in economic development and in particular about the role of government in economic development of Indigenous folks. So we'll come back to that. But the idea of Nunavut is an interesting one, and I want to sort of take a little bit of time to go through the Nunavut experience. It gets an enormous amount of international attention. If I want to go and give a talk at an international conference, if I put down that I'm studying Indigenous people of northern Saskatchewan, people will say, well, it doesn't really fit. If you write down and say, I'm studying the Inuit, and I want to talk about the Inuit, there's an almost automatic entry. Around the world, folks love to study and hear about the Inuit. This is a long-standing historical reality. When the first Europeans arrived, they simply could not believe that people could live in the Arctic. They look at all this ice and all this snow and all these rocks and no trees and no plants and all this kind of stuff, very few plants, and they think, well, nobody can live there. And so when they saw the Inuit and their dog sleds and their ice igloos and things of that sort, they thought, wow, this is absolutely fascinating. The French absolutely adore Inuit studies. They're really, really passionate about Inuit studies. Across Europe, there's a long-standing interest in this as well. The contemporary manifestation of this is probably Inuit art. Anybody here have Inuit art in their home of some sort of description? And lovely stuff, right? Did you know that was an economic development strategy of the government of Canada? So the Inuit art actually came in the, Inuit people have really phenomenally adaptive. That's the strength. I mean, they just adapt to whatever's in front of them, and that's how they survived over thousands and thousands of years very successfully. What happened in the 1950s is the traditional economy is tanking. The traditional economy in the north was fur trade, so people stopped buying furs in a major way in the 1950s. So the fur trade is declining. There's a whole bunch of problems with starvation, particularly in northern Quebec and in what's now Nunavut, the eastern Arctic. So they actually had an economic development officer named James Houston who was sent up north to say, find something to do. Find something that people can do. And you walk up into these communities, you've got 300 people sitting right on the next to the ocean. There's a little bit of fishing, a little bit of hunting going on. But, no companies are planning to relocate there. Let's open a Walmart. Well, it's not going to happen in these really isolated places. And so what he came up with, working with the communities and sort of watching the folks, is discovered that they were very artistically minded. That when you put things in front of them, gave them things to work with, they were really good at sort of drawing and really good at sort of visual representations of their own culture. And so they started carving, soapstone carving. They only did a little bit of that historically. They did sort of little amulets that were used for spiritual purposes and things, but there wasn't a trade in Inuit art before. There wasn't a sort of a big culture of it. Imagine if you're living in a mobile environment and you've made a whole bunch of big, large soapstone carvings. You're going to haul those with you all over the ice. You're not going to do that, right? So they had the skill, but not the sort of. There's no reason to have a market. Anyway, he started with two things. One was soapstone carving, and the people initially carved what they saw. Polar bears. Some of you have polar bears. Some of you have seals. Some of you have an Inuit hunter hunting a polar bear or a seal. These kind of traditional sort of things. And then they started doing printmaking. And if you look at the trees in Nunavut, there are no trees in Nunavut, you'll realize that making prints on paper is actually not a traditional art, right? It is something they are very, very good at. In the same way that if you look at in Australia, they have dot art that they do down there that's really stunning. Same sort of process. They did it traditionally, but they didn't do it commercially, and government people came along and created that industry. So you actually end up with a very, very prominent Inuit art industry that actually reinforced the international excitement about these art forms. And so a number of Inuit artists became very, very well known. They set up art cooperatives so that everybody would sort of create the art, and they would actually send it off, and they get paid their fee. The art cooperative would take their commission, and it became a major industry. Still is, by the way. There still are some wonderful, wonderful art, many wonderful artists in lots of different places across the Art of Pangnirtung and all these different communities, which is kind of an interesting piece. I will tell you one piece about that artwork that's kind of intriguing. There have been attempts by Inuit artists over the years to use more modern imagery. One of my favorite pieces of Inuit art I've ever seen was a carving of an Inuit man on a snowmobile. And what it shows is this guy going really fast. You know, and if you've ever been on how many people have been on snowmobiles? We're in Saskatchewan. This is a second form of life, right? If you go really fast, you notice what happens to your cheeks. They start to flop away, right? And you know, your face gets sort of pulled back, and you feel really cold. This guy does beautiful, beautiful things. This guy's going down the road, and he's like this really fast. And so he submitted it to the co-op, and the co-op initially, and actually for quite a while, said, "We won't sell this." So why won't you sell this? Yeah, because it doesn't show them doing traditional things. And what people want is traditional Inuit art. They want to know you have a snowmobile. They want to think you're standing out by a blowhole waiting for the seals to pop up. And so they don't really like that modern sort of thing. So they've wrestled with this question of sort of what representations do the Inuit want to make, because their value lies in sort of what you call, internationally they call tribal art. Sort of very traditional art forms. And the people who are buying it don't often sit down and think, printmaking isn't indigenous to this area, and large soapstone carving wasn't a traditional sort of form, but nonetheless. So the Inuit in the 1950s and 60s suffered an awful lot of dislocation. The other thing that happened was that the government moved them large distances. So the Inuit were still living very traditionally, moving across the land. Some of them were starving, particularly in northern Quebec. And several things happened. They decided they were going to move, since they were going to be dependent on government anyway, they would relocate them. So how far would they relocate them? From northern Quebec to the southern part of Ellesmere Island. It's actually on a different island, but Resolute Bay, Joa Haven. These are places hundreds of kilometers away. It's like taking somebody from Saskatoon and saying, oh, by the way, we're going to relocate you to Newfoundland. It's thousands of kilometers away in a completely different zone, and they were uninhabited areas. So if they're uninhabited, it probably means there aren't so much in the way of resources. That's kind of why they're uninhabited. Why would the government do that? What would the rationale be for the government relocating an indigenous community more than a couple of thousand kilometers away from their home?
I know.
Do you? Go ahead.
That they wanted that space occupied by citizens.
It's a sovereignty play. What Jocelyn said was...
Ken?
Yes? Yep. I wasn't sure if you heard Jocelyn.
Sorry, we're having a lot of problems with the podcast signal.
Okay, point made. I'm going to go see if I can get this all rebooted, okay? Everybody just take a couple of minutes. Sorry, thanks again.
Yes, sorry for all this. It's just your stories were really interesting about the art and the...
Not your problem at all. It's our problem.
And the snowmobiles and the relocation and all the points like the...
Thanks, Brad. Needed a coffee break.
I'm going to right now. Sorry, guys. So, sorry again, folks. WebExers, do you want to just sign off? And we're going to sort of reboot the system right away. And I'm not sure if Shirley might send you another WebEx connection or something like that. But, Brad, when you were talking to us, we heard about every fourth word.
Okay, sounds good. I'm logging out.
Okay, thank you. The joys of modern technology. It's really interesting. You think of, if you knew how many hundreds of millions of dollars were spent on developing video conferencing systems, and this kind of problem is so common. It's just so frustrating. You think that they just figure out a way to make it so much faster and better. Drives me nuts. Have you seen the systems they have now where you can actually have somebody speak in here in English and have it come out the other end in a different language? Which is really neat. You can actually speak here and it'll come out in Japanese. And you can actually have a conference call where the people in Japan hear it in Japanese, the people in Germany hear it in German.
And how well does that work?
What's that?
How well does it work?
Well, I mean, with subjects of the same problems you have here, probably about 100 times better than last year, and next year it'll be 1,000 times better than this year. So every single, this is the part that I find kind of freaky, every single conversation is actually training the system. So that as you're working through the system and using it, it actually is sort of learning for inflections and accents and all that sort of stuff. You don't believe this?
Well, can it do it in Inuktitut?
Well, this is an interesting piece that you say this, because one of the things that folks are trying to get these big tech companies to do is to realize that these technologies could actually be a key part of the salvation of indigenous languages. So what happens, of course, everybody does Japanese, Chinese, Mandarin, Cantonese, German, French, Spanish, because that's where the market is, right? If you actually think where the utility is, this could be really, really important. There's a little bit of work like that being done in different. I'm not sure about Inuktitut, but wouldn't it be great if we actually could use those technologies in that sort of way? Unfortunately, if you had it, what would they end up being used for is to let the last speakers continue to speak to other people. It wouldn't be the other way around. It wouldn't necessarily be a training sort of process. Yep, Jocelyn?
We're very high tech in the
Well, yes and no. They want to be. I was in Iqaluit, I think, in April, and the internet there was shameful. So unbelievably bad. You know, if you had are you signing on again, Brad, or signing off?
Oh, I'm back here now.
Did you reboot it, Shirley?
No. I think you have to do it again.
Go ahead then. I don't know what to do.
Bye-bye, Brad.
You should train me. Brad, we're going to shut you off. Nothing personal.
Okay.
Shirley's going to save the day for us.
Yeah, right. I'll try.
So in Iqaluit, if you had a regular phone bill that had sort of, first off, your cell coverage is very limited. If you go sort of 5 steps outside the town, it'll stop working. But it'll probably cost you about $600 or $700 a month for a full data package. That's a lot of money. I was there in the evening, sitting at the hotel desk, and was complaining about the internet and saying, well, this is the norm, right? And it's super, super slow. So in the hotel, when I walked into on the bed in the hotel, there's a big piece of paper sitting in the thing that says, we apologize for the internet. They pay really high, it's all satellite based, so they pay really high fees to sort of download the satellite, the stuff from the satellite. And they said, please don't use Netflix. If one person in the hotel uses Netflix, nobody else will get their email. And you're sitting there, you write an answer an email, and it takes 3 minutes to load. That's very, very frustrating. Very frustrating. So they do want to be high tech. They're absolutely right about that. They've done some interesting things, but the capacity's wrong. And do things. And Iqaluit's good compared to the other communities, where it's almost non-existent. The frustrating thing here is if you know where Greenland is, Greenland's right across Davis Strait, and there's a community called Nuuk, which is the capital of Greenland. They have a fiber optic cable connection to Nuuk, and actually it's not as far away. It's from Newfoundland. So the connection goes over from Europe over to Newfoundland, Newfoundland up to Nuuk. They're connected up there, and they're not connected over to Iqaluit. It's insane. Just insane. So they're very frustrated by this because when they have conferences and stuff up there, people are so addicted to cell
Well, can anyone hear me, Brad?
Yeah,
I can hear you, Quinn.
Oh,
And now,
okay.
Candace, I can hear you also, and Quinn.
So did you guys all see like the chat part where we can kind of discuss?
Yeah,
Yeah, that's
I
awesome.
emailed just on chat right now, actually.
Yeah, it's nice. And then, so in class, I don't know if Ken knows this, but there's actually a little hand symbol. If you press it, it means like you want to speak. And on his screen, it should kind of like,
Interrupt.
well, not interrupt, but it'll like kind of highlight that you want
Hello?
to speak. Do you know what I mean?
Can anybody hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Test, test, test.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I
Awesome.
don't know, like, are they on WebEx or are they sending out another email? I wasn't sure, so I went back on.
I think they cut the signal twice because there was once where they said Ken left and said he was going to reboot it, and then I got an email from Amy, and then it was for me, it was just dropping. Like I missed his story. Like there was the Inuit art and all like the key build up point. I missed that. Then he talked about the snowmobiles. I was listening, and then the point dropped, and he talked about the relocation. I was like, then it dropped. So
yeah, that's what I got too. It was,
right? It was like, darn it. So,
yeah, that's kind of what I got too.
I got the same thing too as well, so I'm assuming that those are good
We talk
questions
about
for the
paved roads in Norway, we talk about bandwidth in New Zealand, these are tiny, tiny countries.
Yep.
So the economies of scale and the lack thereof.
Yep.
And
Excellent.
how it affects spending and governance and everything else. You know, if you physically have to be there to vote, how can you do that when
It's $5,000 to fly there. Hey, I think we have connections. Gail, I can see you up there. Can you hear us okay?
Yep, I can hear you good. Just keep
Oh,
talking.
Okay. Quinn, are you there?
I am here. Yes.
Yay. Okay. Everybody else is there?
yep.
Yeah, I think we're missing Prav and
Shy Cat.
yeah.
Candace is there now?
Yeah, I'm here.
Rath is there? Okay, can you do that? Hey, thanks, Shirley.
It looks like we're not going to get faces, though.
That's most of them don't have their cameras on, so we don't need their faces. Well, we like their faces, we just don't need their faces for purposes of the class. So let me go back and try to pick up the Nunavut story. It is interesting, sort of watching what's happened over time because of it was back actually your point about geography. Nunavut's a huge area. Total population of Nunavut's about 35,000 people. It's scattered over an area that's massive in scale. Nunavut, their most southerly communities are actually down by James Bay. They're actually south of Saskatoon. And the most northerly ones are there's no Aboriginal people up there, but way up in the very tip of Ellesmere Island, which is close to the North Pole, right? So this is a huge jurisdiction with a tiny, tiny population. About 5,000 or 6,000 of the Inuit actually live in Iqaluit. You know, so that's a disproportionately influential sort of place. They were also part of the Northwest Territories. So where's the capital of the Northwest Territories? Nope. Sorry? Yellowknife?
Whitehorse?
No, Whitehorse is the capital of the Yukon. This is not supposed to be a geography test, but so far we're not doing so well. So Yellowknife is the capital. What was the capital of the Northwest Territories? Still is. Northwest Territories, by the way, is not the most northerly part of Canada, nor is it the most westerly part of Canada. And it's a ridiculous name that actually used to be the name for this area. Saskatchewan was now Saskatchewan, used to be part of the Northwest Territories. So I don't know if you ever know this, they were going to have a competition to pick a new name for the area. Did you hear about this before? So what do you call it? Well, it's actually, most of the area is actually a Dene territory. So the Aboriginal name of the area is Denendeh. Kind of a nice sound. Denendeh is homeland, basically. This is our homeland, the people's land. The problem with that name is that what's now the Northwest Territories, the very top end has Inuvialuit. They're Inuit people. And so you're going to call a territory Denendeh when a good portion of the people in Inuvik and around there are actually Inuit. So they said, okay, well, let's have a vote, not an official one, So the newspaper said, here's a whole bunch of names, Den and Day, and we call it this, Northwest Territories and all that kind of stuff. So do you know the winning name? Bob. So somebody put a name and said, let's just call it Bob. Let's just call it Bob. Exactly, the same sort of thing. So we're going to call it Bob. And Bob won. But they didn't make it into the official name of the Yukon. Bob and Nunavut would have been really interesting. So Yellowknife, you can imagine how you would get from Ellesmere Island, Joy Haven, to Yellowknife. You actually, even with airplanes, you have to fly all the way down to Ottawa. You have to fly from Ottawa all the way to Edmonton, from Edmonton all the way to Yellowknife. It's a huge distance, right? Secondly, the folks way up north in Nunavut have very nothing to do with the folks who are down in Northwest Territories. Historically, not very many contacts, right? So they started sort of having difficulty. It's a difficult place to manage. In fact, almost ungovernable, right? So the federal government, actually the capital of the Northwest Territories before Yellowknife was actually Ottawa. They actually used to run the government of Northwest Territories out of Ottawa, which kind of didn't sound very nice for the people. And Yellowknife only became the capital in 1967. It's a fairly recent sort of development in that context. The Northwest Territories is somewhat ungovernable. As it gained responsible government, and the Northwest Territories only got responsible government in the 1980s. Responsible government means you control your own budget, you make your own decisions. Before that time, the government of Northwest Territories was only advisory. So they would get together, have a meeting, and say, we want to do this, and the commissioner would say, I don't think so. I'm going to spend the money over here. You want us to build a road this way? We're going to build a road that way. So then what they did in the Northwest Territories, this is the old Northwest Territories, they actually came up with what they called consensus government. And a consensus government means no party politics. So in the Yukon, if you have an election, it's the Liberals, Yukon Party, and the NDP. Very similar to Saskatchewan or British Columbia or anywhere else. In Nunavut, and even now, but in the Northwest Territories back then, the consensus government was you elect representatives from your community, they all get together, they elect the premier, and then they elect the cabinet ministers. And anybody who's not in the cabinet is kind of the opposition party. So they're not a party, they're just opposition members. And their job is to critique and criticize and support and otherwise do what they want to do. It's a very interesting sort of model. And from the Aboriginal point of view, they said, we don't want to get contests. We want to divide our community between political parties and everything else. It is the Northwest Territories in the old form, one of the most over-governed places on the planet, in the sense that, you had, at that time, only 45,000 people, had about 18 members of the legislature, so each person only represented a couple of thousand people. It was a very, very small area. The positions were highly sought after. It wasn't uncommon to have a community would have 16 or 18 people run to be their MLA. Why? It's the best job in town. You get a nice high income, you get to live part of the time in Yellowknife, you get to travel back and forth, and so you have these really interesting things. I remember seeing some of the results where the person won with 25 votes because everybody else got 23 votes or 22 votes or 21 votes, and there's only 400 people in the community and only 200 electors, and so you don't have to win very many votes in order to win. But the consensus system actually attracted an awful lot of attention. Basically, the folks in the Eastern Arctic said, this isn't working for us. This isn't working for us. It does not make our society function very well. And so they started pushing for division. They had a very, very long conversation about where to divide. The Inuvialuit in the Inuvik area are Inuit. They did not want to join with the Inuit in the Eastern Arctic. Now, the reason is partly historical in the sense that they're different peoples, different dialects and whatever else, different economies. At that time, the Beaufort Sea oil and gas development was underway, and there was a chance that actually the Beaufort Sea and Inuvialuit area was going to become one of the wealthiest parts of Canada. For a time, the Beaufort Sea was going to be Fort McMurray. It was going to be, and this is 1980s, it was going to be this place with big economic booms and lots of sort of opportunities. And the government, the people in Inuvialuit were not very anxious to share that with the folks in the Eastern Arctic. The other complication, this is one of these really sensitive ones, the people who are called the Inuvialuit live in the area around Inuvik, actually moved into the area from Alaska in the 19th century. So when the whaling herds, when the whalers came up to Alaska in the 1870s and 1880s, they moved over into the Mackenzie Delta in the 1890s. And the Inuvialuit followed them. And so, as some people have said, some of the other indigenous people have said, well, you're not even Canadians. Your ancestry is American. But the Inuvialuit have been recognized as Canadian indigenous peoples, and they have a land claim and things of that sort. So they decided on division. So where do you put the line? Well, the Inuvialuit are going to stay in one direction. In the Mackenzie Valley, so the Dene folks are going to stay in the Western Arctic. They had a really interesting process of finding out where the border was going to be. And the primary thing they used was actually language. They went on the land with elders, and they sort of, you travel on the land, you go down the river, and you have names for everything, right? You have names for big rocks and big trees or clumps or harvesting areas, fishing spots. And then the names start to sort of filter out. You have fewer and fewer names because you actually don't use it very much. So you have a name-intensive area here. You have a sort of an area in the middle where you don't, not so much. And then you go further down and you don't have any names. So they did this with all sorts of elders all along what's now the boundary of the Nunavut to the Northwest Territories. And they discovered these zones. They always had crossover zones where people on both sides actually had names for the area where they hunted and fished on sort of either side. But they created Nunavut. And in a period in the 1990s, this absolutely remarkable transition where they settled in the Nunavut land claim, a major settlement with the people of what's now Nunavut. And they created Nunavut itself. 1999 was created as a separate territory. At the time, it was the largest indigenous-controlled jurisdiction in the world. Greenland doesn't have full autonomy, is moving toward independence. It has a larger population, 55,000 people, and a very interesting place. Greenland had full literacy by the middle of the 19th century. Like Greenland had its own printing presses, newspapers in their own language in the middle of the 19th century. And what happened was the missionaries came up, and instead of trying to teach them, Danish, they were from Denmark. They actually learned the local language and started publishing books and newspapers in their own language, which is really interesting. So you have full literacy in the middle of the 19th century. They had more literacy in 1850 or 1860 in Greenland than we actually have now in Nunavut, which is just an interesting sort of part of that process. The world was really interested in Nunavut. It just happened to be in London, England. The Canadian High Commission was putting on an event, and they said, "Will you come down and speak?" There were 3 or 4 of us who were asked to come and speak at this meeting. I thought, well, that'll be kind of interesting. Go down and talk to some folks, right? And sure there'll be tea and crackers and cookies and other British stuff they have, and we'll just have a nice afternoon. Well, the place was absolutely jammed. There were like 40 journalists there come over from Europe specifically to hear more about Nunavut. If you'd done the same thing with the Dene, if you had done the same thing with the Gwich'in, if you'd done the same thing with the Haida, you would have had 5 people in the room. But the Nunavut thing was spectacular on scale and size and self-control and autonomy and everything else. And it just reflects that sort of long-standing, I call it enduring sort of fascination with the Inuit. So what's happened in Nunavut since 1999? We're about 20 years into this sort of process. There's been some real achievements, and they're worth noting. Inuit governance, the consensus-style government works. Journalists have real trouble every year. Every time they have an election, they get together and they select a premier. And then the next time around, the same person runs again, and they don't select him as premier, or don't select her as premier. And sometimes the person's upset, and sometimes they're not. They say, okay, so somebody else's turn, I don't care. All happens behind closed doors, not a public sort of voting sort of process. But Inuit governance has actually worked out relatively well. They're trying to get an Inuktitut language administration. It's not working out completely, but not for want of effort. It's really hard to find non-Inuit people who can speak the language. Very, very few of those. Very heavy turnover. Over the years, I've had a fair number of students go up there, and if they're up there for 4 years, they'll have 7 jobs. And they'll go really quickly, going bing, 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 bing. All of a sudden, you've got somebody who's your student 4 years ago, and they're assistant deputy minister. Because the turnovers are really high. People tend not to stay. The work is very challenging, and the opportunity is absolutely stunning. The last time I was up there, I sat down with a young lady who was responsible for Nunavut's global international relationships. And we were trying to sort of get them connected up with Japan and with China and South Korea. My wife is a specialist in those areas. And so we're sitting down and we said, well, what's the job like? And she says, this is the world's greatest job. She's from the community. She'd gone off and got a master's degree in international studies. She's back running the international studies office for Nunavut. The world is beating a path to her door. She and her office get invitations to go. She's to be on the plane constantly. Everybody wants Nunavut to come down and be represented in different kinds of things. And she said, the only problem she has is because she's a very smart lady. She goes, you just get too many pressure to go and take other jobs. I said, what kind of jobs? She said, well, I can't remember exactly what they were, but they're equivalent of sort of saying, do you want to run the prison system or do you want to be in the finance department? Is that kind of this is, again, the politics of small is on the other side. You can move around really, really quickly. And they've got some terrific folks working in the Nunavut government and Nunavut administration. And what's interesting is the people who move tend to be non-Inuit people. The ones who stay tend to be the Inuit folks. This is their dream, to actually be part of government they've created. The Inuit have maintained a massive international presence. They have become the symbol of climate change. Sylvia Watt-Cloutier, who's one of the most prominent Inuit leaders, actually is from northern Quebec, came up with this wonderful phrase. Mary Simon is the other one, very, very powerful female political leaders from the north, that there's a human right to be cold. And it's a wonderful phrase because it draws your attention to climate change. Is sort of, people say, oh, it's getting warmer, you must be happy. Climate change is having way more impact in the far north than it is anywhere else. We're actually seeing small bits of that here, but it's more just as a little bit warmer, a little bit colder, a little bit this, a little bit that. They've actually got bugs showing up where they didn't have bugs. They've got real problems with permafrost. When the permafrost starts to freeze, buildings buckle. You've got a house built on permafrost, it's like built on concrete, and when it starts to melt, the part of the house just sort of starts to slide down the hillside. Massive problems with erosion. If you look at we had a presentation from a guy who'd actually been going up to the same part of Nunavut for 60 years. Every year he took his research team up. So he actually showed us pictures of, here's what it looked like 60 years ago. And 50 was much the same, 40 much the same, 30 a little bit different, 20 a little bit different. And the last 20 years, boing, 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 boing. And just seeing the erosion that's happening and the hillsides that are falling down. We're getting all sorts of interesting animal migrations moving up into Nunavut, things we hadn't ever expected to see. Warmer seasons. There's more grass. There's more plants. Birds are showing up in the wrong place. And so the interesting part of this, it actually causes some real challenges for traditional Inuit knowledge, because the stuff doesn't work anymore. Well, the ice will go out at this time of the year. When this happens, the ice is going. Yeah, not so much. Real problems with ice coverage in the north as a whole. The Inuit have become a global symbol. A lot of that's because of Al Gore. A lot of that's because of Time Magazine. Did you see Time Magazine's with the polar bear sitting on the ice and they're talking about this, right? I hate that picture. They've been used a billion times around the world. How do you think polar bears always got around? They jumped on an ice floe, and the current would take it over, right? That you could have taken that picture 180 years ago. The fact that a polar bear is on an ice floe actually isn't the end of the world. And there's a huge debate, and I say this because I don't know the resolution of this, about the whole question of polar bears and how many polar bears there are out there. We don't know the number. We're trying to keep the Inuit are actually think they say there's a lot more polar bears, partly because the polar bears are actually moving closer to the towns and they're causing more of a hassle. The government of the United States banned the importation of polar bear pelts and destroyed the big game hunting economy in some communities. You just have to pay $35,000 to $50,000 to go hunting a polar bear. And in a small community, if you only had 4 hunters a year, say $50,000, $200,000 is a lot of money in a small town. That's gone now. Because you can't shoot you can shoot the polar bear. You come to Canada to shoot the polar bear, you just can't take the skin with you. So, that's not such a big deal. I met a wonderful guy, he's one of the cabinet ministers in Nunavut, and we're sitting down talking about hunting, and we were comparing hunting in the Yukon to hunting in Nunavut, and he was talking about going polar bear hunting and stuff. And it turns out that he's a huge fan of safari hunting. Oh, I shot a giraffe, and I shot an elephant, and I shot this and that, he was enjoying it. Interesting guy. Cultural revitalization, they're doing some fascinating things on cultural revitalization. If you look at the Inuit Broadcasting Corporation, it's done some amazing work they've actually created Inuit superheroes, Inuit cartoons, sort of ways in their own language, to get young people sort of more familiar with using traditional languages and whatever. The artistic work is better than ever. There's more of it and it's more diverse. Have you ever heard Inuit throat singers? I mean, they're amazing, right? There's absolutely astonishing stuff. They're getting an audience. They're becoming very prominent sort of singers, and they're mixing traditional and non-traditional music, and the artistic stuff is going great. Watch the Nunavut Development Corporation on the kind of achievements. The Nunavut Development Corporation currently has, if I remember correctly, something like $2.5 billion of investable assets. It's one of the largest development corporations in the country. If the Mary River mine goes through to its 20-year cycle, they will make $2 billion out of that one mine, in addition to their current asset base. So the Nunavut Development Corporation and the other development corporations are extremely aggressive. They are some of the foremost pro-resource development organizations around. Their logic basically is, we need to have money in the bank, we need to have investable assets, we need to build new economies, our people are tired of being poor. And so the development corporations, we'll talk about this in the general context later in a few seconds, but they're doing very well and are very powerful. Some people argue that the Nunavut Development Corporation is more powerful than government of Nunavut. Government of Nunavut has more money to spend, but it's all committed. So you have to pay for education, you have to pay for healthcare. If you want to do extra things, if you want to set up a culture camp, chances are you don't go to the Nunavut government, you actually go to the Nunavut Development Corporation and say we need $100,000 to do these kinds of things, and off they go. Nunavut has done a good job of its relations with the government of Canada. When Prime Minister Harper was Prime Minister, you'll notice that every single summer he went up to Nunavut and got his picture taken on the ice, and usually with a warship in the background or a port development or a mining operation or something like that. The Nunavut do a great job of keeping the federal government on board. Northwest Territories, in contrast, has real trouble. Not for any fault of their own. They really try really hard. They're just not as, in quotation marks, interesting. You know, to go to Yellowknife, Yellowknife's a great little town, but it doesn't nowhere near as exotic as going to Grise Fiord or going to Yohoe-Haven or going to Cole Harbour or those other really interesting Inuit sort of places. The government of Canada every year has a diplomatic tour where they offer people who are coming in, people who are just arrived in Canada. So we're going to give you a tour of the country to show you what's going on and what it's like. And they take them to the north, which is really interesting. You got to figure that the diplomats will make their way to Vancouver or Montreal on their own. So they pick them up on a plane in Ottawa, and they go up to Nunavut, and they go hop these communities sort of all the way across. They do go to Inuvik. I think they go to Yellowknife, and they go to Whitehorse, and then they fly back to Ottawa in that way. So it's really, imagine being on the plane. I've never been on the plane with them, but I met them up in Inuvik one time, just because I happened to be in town at the same time. And it's really interesting, because this is like in July, and you see all these folks from literally around the world. You know, from small Pacific Island countries, from Africa, from Latin America, and they've just had this incredible trip where they're flying across millions and millions and millions of square miles of empty sort of area, and absolutely mind-boggled by the process. So, a friend of mine one time was the High Commissioner from Zambia. Got to know him in a very interesting sort of context, and so he was on this. He phoned me up. He says, "I'm going on this trip," and he said, "I'd really like to be informed. So can you send me some things to read?" So I sent him a bunch of books to read. He phoned back. He said, "Can you give me some questions that I can ask in each community?" And so we gave some thought to this. Okay, when you're Yohoe-Haven, ask this. When you're here, and he said at the end of it, he phoned back. He said, "I have a great time. I never told them about you. I didn't say a word about where I got this from. And every time we got to a town, and he would say, go get into Inuvik, and he said, well, what year did the Dew Line open, and what was its impact on the community? Da, 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 da. Oh, where did you find that out, right? And he didn't tell them. He said he promised he'd tell them later on that I played a role in this, but I suspect he didn't, because he had a lot of fun, and they actually by the end they were getting kind of afraid of him because we were getting closer to my land, right? So in Eastern Arctic I could ask them general, when you get to Whitehorse, holy moly, it was really very, very specific. We had lots of fun. That was great. And there also another achievement is the level of government funding. Nunavut's the most heavily subsidized society on the earth. The only possible exception are American military bases. So American military bases live in a different world altogether, but Nunavut is massively, massively subsidized. The per capita allocation is like 3 times what it is for Newfoundland, and Newfoundland is 3 times what it is for Saskatchewan. That is only a gross sum. It doesn't talk about need. It only talks about the high level of sort of support that they get. Jocelyn?
95% of our homes social housing.
Oh, absolutely. Almost entirely.
Ownership.
No, very, very, almost no home ownership at all. And in fact, if you talk to civil servants who move up there, they don't even contemplate buying houses. They just we're in a social housing. Right now, there are about 3,000 to 4,000 houses minimum that they need to build in Nunavut just to meet the existing known demand. And if you actually tried to take Nunavut back to the average occupancy level, the average occupancy level in Canada is about, I think it's 2.3 people per house or something like that. And Nunavut would be about 7. These are ridiculous rates of home occupancy.
So I traveled around there for 10 days. But what I know, what we've seen right away, those social housing, they're duplexes, 2-bedroom duplexes, and there's three generations living within those two and maybe 2 families, right?
Yep. And think about a couple of things, Jocelyn. You're absolutely right. 3 generations in a house, overcrowding in a whole bunch of different ways. The multiple generations is actually pretty traditional for Inuit. That's living in an extended family is not by itself a shock. But it's when you have 8 kids in the family, in one family and all the people lined up there. The houses are not built to take that weight. So when you actually, it's just something as simple as actually a toilet seats and doors. If you have 3 times as many people are supposed to have that, the doors will wear out faster. The toilet seats will break. The plumbing will break down, right? And it was really interesting, thinking of the implications of that, which people just don't do. And what are the challenges? Huge challenges around education. On a political level, the people of Nunavut want very much to be a Nuktatuk environment. They very much want to be a place where the language is strong and the language is vibrant. A lot of parents don't want that. A lot of the parents basically say, if my kids aren't educated in English and French, they'll never get a job. And the more time you spend studying in Inuktitut, the less time is being seen as a zero-sum game. We actually know that's not true. That in fact, people that are learning multiple languages learn both languages. We actually tried this in the French immersion program. It doesn't work very well in Canada. But if you actually look in Scandinavia, where kids often learn 3 and 4 languages, they actually do extremely well. In Nunavut, it's not working out very, very well. One of the things about poverty, the evidence actually comes more from the United States, is that a poor family hears 3 million fewer words a year than a wealthy family, which slows your language development, your comprehension, your vocabulary. All these things suffer as a consequence. So you have Indigenous people who are poor, the grandparents who are living in the house, as Jocelyn says, are speaking a traditional language. The parents are sort of a little bit between both, and the kids are trying to, what do I learn? And there's a real tension between, we want this to be an Inuktitut language region, and we want the kids ready for the 21st century. So what happens, this is a real problem, is that many of the more successful, economically successful Inuit folks are moving their kids down south. They're reproducing the boarding school experience in much more accommodating locations, but that's why there's 3,000 Inuit living in Montreal. I know several families where the wife and the kids have relocated to Ottawa. The husband is working up in the north in Nunavut, but they want their kids to go to a public school and learn English properly, learn French properly, and get all the development skills. Education is a huge problem. Very great shortcomings in science and technology, mathematics, the STEM disciplines. Very, very serious problem, and that carries over into the training areas. Interestingly, some of the mines are doing great work. A couple of the mines, Mary River's doing very well in sort of coordinating things with local communities. They want to train people into the jobs that actually exist. But here's an unexpected twist, although we now should expect it. When people go and work in Mary River, about 25% of them, as soon as they start working and get settled in the job, they relocate their families down to Montreal or Ottawa. And that's where the white folks come from. The non-Aboriginal people live down south. And the Inuit folks say, well, I can afford to live in Montreal. I'm making $120,000 a year. So I can move my family down to Montreal. I can live down there. And the worker can be the one who goes back and forth. And the family can actually live down there, which wasn't the model. The model was that $120,000 income would actually go to the local nearest community. That would actually be part of their economic development. And now it's not, right? Which is really interesting. That's why it's a complication, is why it's a challenge. Major issues around what I describe here as social safety. These communities are very violent. I think I told you the story of Pangnirtung. They had just got off a very, very good year with no suicide attempts and no suicides. In the month of April, they had 12 suicide attempts. The communities, why? Because they're crowded housing, because there's no real logical jobs that are there, which leads to alcohol and drug abuse, which leads to domestic violence, which leads to all the other sort of social sort of challenges. Over the last 10 years, we've had really serious conflicts with the police. We've had several police officers killed, basically by going into domestic violence situations and being stabbed or shot. So the police are sort of nervous about these environments. And if you go to Penguin, I've never been to Penguin. When people go into places like Penguin, and they you know, the community would show up, you'd have 300 people show up saying, we want to make things better. We really, really want to make things better. This is not a situation where the community members are over there sort of having some sort of a wild party and don't care what's happening in government. The people who are having struggles get together, they come and they sit down and they say, what can we do about this? And when the problems are so deep, and the problems have to do with language loss and cultural loss, and the fact that Greenpeace shut them off from selling seals into Europe and carved away a big part of their economy and their lifestyle, you know, it's kind of unrelenting. And then somebody says, oh, by the way, climate change is eroding, your house is going to fall into the ocean in a couple of years, and your community is going to suffer with permafrost sort of damage. Oh, and by the way, you have no housing. You know, oh, we got a grant. We're going to build 5 new houses in town this year. Yeah, we have one of the highest birth rates in the world, and we're getting lots of young people coming along. And where are we going to put them? And how are we going to get them into education? And how are we going to get them trained properly? The government of Nunavut also very early on decided they would decentralize government services. They saw government as a way of building regional economies. So you would actually take some of government departments and put them in Rankin Inlet. You take the head of the Nunavut College, you put it somewhere else. You take this, you know, fisheries, we put it over in this other community. Under Grant Devine, by the way, Saskatchewan tried exactly the same thing. Thought they could reinforce small towns. What did Kindersley get? Did Kindersley get something? I can't remember. Anyway, well, the whole idea was you just distribute the government offices and let the people do it. They can phone each other. Well, it turns out they can't phone each other, and it turns out in Nunavut, you want to have a cabinet meeting of deputy ministers. Well, actually, they're actually in 8 different communities. Let's fly them in. Well, that'll actually cost us about $25,000 to fly them in for one meeting. And by the way, we scheduled a meeting and it's on tomorrow, but there's snowstorms located in 3 of those communities. We can't get out for 4 days. So therefore, the phone thing breaks down. Oh, we'll just use this. We'll use the video conference. Well, you can see what's happening today here. Well, imagine up in Nunavut where it doesn't work at all. It works very, very, very limited sort of way. So decentralization didn't work. So the attempt to use government to build the communities actually has not been overly successful. And the last challenge is the one that one can't be overcome. There is no cheap way to do this. There's absolutely no cheap way to do this. And essentially you can say, why don't we move everybody out? This is draconian 1950s kind of policies. And you say to people in Nunavut, you know, close down your communities, relocate, you pick the place. If Iqaluit actually all of a sudden became 35,000 people, you'd have economies of scale, you could get high-speed internet in there, you could do all the kinds of things. There's no water, not enough water probably, but we can probably solve that too. That's not going to happen. No government in Canada ever even offer that, and no communities are going to give it up as an option. And then you get into this challenge of the thing that Nunavut worries about is they are doing a good job of keeping the government informed. The government is doing a good job of increasing their annual allocations. The government of Nunavut costs well over $1 billion a year for about $1.5 billion a year for 35,000 people. Yukon gets $1.2 billion a year in transfers from the federal government. These are massively subsidized places. Yukon, the costs aren't very high. Yukon costs are sort of like British Columbia costs. They're high, but they're not that bad. But Nunavut costs are frighteningly high. Got to get the diesel in. Most of these communities, you have to bring in ships only once or twice a year. Got to get all your year's supplies in at that time, or else you bring stuff in by plane. That's really expensive to bring that way. So energy is through the roof. Food is through the roof. Fresh food is ridiculously expensive. You know, so what lifestyle are we going to support as a country? What lifestyle do you support in Nunavut? So I think in one sense, I don't say it's easy, but it's fairly clear that Nunavut is not met the promise. Oh, this is what Nunavut's going to be like. Well, Nunavut isn't quite there, and is not going to be there in the short term. I'm not even sure it's going to be there in the long term. And for the people of Nunavut, they've taken control of this themselves. We'll talk about this a bit as we go forward. They have some of the largest infrastructure projects proposed in Canada, under Indigenous control. They are supportive of mining activity and port development. They want to see things actually happen. They have strategies to save the money. So the Nunavut Development Corporation is based on the sort of the Norwegian model, that you don't just sort of spend it all because you've got it, you actually invest it. Norway has a thing where 80% of the revenue from oil and gas revenues are actually invested. Norway has more than $1 trillion last time I checked. $1 trillion invested to subsidize forever their social welfare system. So in Norway, post-secondary education is free. Well, as long as you have oil there, and as long as you save the oil money. Alberta had exactly the same opportunity. They just had to build hockey rinks. So Alberta has the highest expenditure on social services and public services of any part of the country. If they'd only just stayed at the national average, they would have had hundreds of billions of dollars sitting in a long-term investment pot which they couldn't bring themselves to do. So the people of Nunavut are prepared to do it, but the economic development's not large enough. And just to end back with sort of the places where it never ends in circles, in January of 2017, when Barack Obama, just before he left office, the government of Canada, as a parting gift to Barack Obama, put a moratorium on oil and gas exploration in the Arctic. Obama put the same thing in off the coast of Alaska. So he said, we're going to preserve the Arctic. Donald Trump came in and removed that because it wasn't a law. It was actually just an executive order. So Trump said, okay, go ahead if you want to. You're not surprised by that. The Inuit are suing the government of Canada for putting in the moratorium on oil and gas development. Not because they support it. Not because they want to do it tomorrow. But because they want the choice. They want to have the opportunity to explore it and see what the risks and dangers and all that kind of stuff happen to be. So, interesting sort of situation. A very unique one. One that will always play out in the headlines. Because Nunavut will always have this sort of special character. The only place in the world that really comes close to Nunavut is the Amazon. And you will find similar sort of discussions and worries and concerns in the Amazon basin. Because folks like it. I don't know if you watch this, but every 3 or 4 years, they discover, in quotation marks, the last group of people in the Amazon who never contact with the outside world. We've been doing this for 25 years. Anthropologists are rushing to a rescue. No, stay away. But the Amazon is sort of, it's so impenetrable, it's so hard to get into, it's such a unique environment. It has sort of the same mythology, but the Inuit have the difference of actually being front and center on the global stage. They are very prominent internationally. And if you've ever met people like Mary Simon or Shilawak Kuche, these are amazing political leaders. And they're doing very, very well. Did you have a question, Jocelyn? I sort of went by that.
I was going to make the observation when I was there. I really noticed one thing that struck me the most was that they're not connected at all. They have no highways going into their territories. They have no trains going into their territories.
Yes.
Their main access in is through a plane that you have to catch in Ottawa. And it's super expensive, so that really limits their restriction.
Yep.
And even between the communities, as you're flying in, you see the roads kind of spidering out, but they don't go anywhere, right? And it's really shocking to think like there's no connection here whatsoever, or opportunities for these people to connect with each other. And but I was amazed at how much they knew about us in Canada, like even the Indigenous people. But there's also no connection between the Inuit people and their government with any Indigenous nations. So they have no connection at all to AFN. And that I just kind of realized that. So coming home, I realized like that one highway into your community, that's a lifeline, but for them, like we brought up that issue about this ideal of building a highway, a superhighway, and they weren't all convinced that because opening up the access to them also means opening up a lot of their social issues that they're dealing with. It would be harder for them to control it, but at the same time, the young people need the opportunities to be able to be more mobile and have more connection to opportunities. So that was just
and have career opportunities, right? I mean, the interesting thing is, Aboriginal folks, like anybody else, they dream. What do you want to do when you grow up, right? What are you going to do? What kind of lifestyle are you going to have? And in these small isolated communities, the circle is very, very small. It's interesting. One of the more successful communities is Cambridge Bay, which is right sort of in the middle, on an island just north of the mainland. And the former mayor of Cambridge Bay was a guy I played basketball with when I was in high school. And he then became the Minister of Finance in Nunavut. So we've had conversations over the years about what's actually going on. And his interesting take is, these are great communities to live in. And I said, well, what about the social issues? He says, those are our friends. We just help them. We know they're hurting. And so our job is to help them. And he sees it in a very, very different way. He's not an Aboriginal person. And he sees it in a completely different way. And in the sense of what we see as a problem and a crisis, they often, the non-Aboriginal folks who live there permanently, actually understand the roots of it. And so they're far more sympathetic than we are in Canada. If you walk into the west side of Saskatoon, or and you see an Aboriginal person who's been drinking too much, the reaction is generally kind of visceral. Oh, I'm afraid, I'm scared of that kind of person. Well, in a place up there, the answer is, how can I get them home? Can I walk them back to their house? Make sure they go to bed. It's a very different kind of atmosphere and circumstance. The connectivity issue is staggering. Iqaluit, I think, has 20 kilometers of roads. I was, just only going a short way out of town, just to a park. That's kind of it. They have a neat taxi system, by the way. Taxi system at Iqaluit it costs $7 per person to go anywhere. And so if you flag down a cab, they may have 3 or 4 people in it. You jump in anyway, and it takes them. Where are you going? Oh, we'll drop you off. And everybody pays $7 regardless of where they go. And you have no idea who you're going to get in the car with, and where they're going, and what road you're going to take to get there. It's a very interesting, flexible sort of approach. But the lack of connectivity is absolutely staggering. One of the big projects is actually to build a highway up through from Yellowknife, actually going all the way up to the Arctic Ocean, that would actually open up the western side of Nunavut. And there's at least 3. This is an interesting project because the Inuit want to build the highway. They will actually build it and pay for it. They have got 3 mines who will say you can't open the mine without a road. So the mining companies have said, if you build the road, we will pay for the maintenance. And I think there's a 20 or 25-year sort of commitment that they would make. There's 7 other mining properties that could be developed in that same area as a consequence, right? So they're looking at this and saying, wouldn't this is our solution? And so they're trying to get the government of Canada to sort of, underwrite some of the costs, basically loan them the money so they can make this as a private road, which they think they can make into a viable entity. Right now we have ice roads in the north to some of these places. And another problem with climate change is the season gets shorter and shorter. We lost about a month off the ice road sort of navigation because of, you don't want your trucks to go in the water. Actually, you don't mind too much about the trucks. It's more the truck drivers. You don't want to go in the water. Have anybody been on ice roads? Have you been on ice roads? What's it like?
When I was growing up, we had to drive across an ice road to get to school or to town.
What's it like?
It's cool in the winter and it's terrifying in the fall and the spring.
If you've ever been on these things, you watch sort of the road behind you is going to go like this. It sort of undulates. You worry about it getting a wave action behind it. Yeah, go ahead, Gail.
And up north here by Dillon area, we use the ice road quite a bit in the wintertime, and usually we don't go on the ice road till around maybe late November, early December, depending on how thickness of the ice, because we notice that as well as when the climate change is taking longer now for the lakes to freeze up, and it takes a while. So once we get on the ice road, you have to watch for the cracks, and there's always one section in the middle of the lake you have to be careful because it's usually pretty soft, so you have to know where to go. And people up north are very creative. They'll take trees along with them and they'll mark where, so when you're coming down there, you know where to turn and where not to go. And so it's actually pretty neat.
It's all about resilience, right? It's sort of you make do with what you've got and everything else. But I got a tour and I was in Fort Simpson. We went out for a drive and took us across the ice road. And the guy who was driving was a guy who'd been driving for a very long time and was sort of teasing us. And because we were a little bit nervous, to my mind, the truck was a bit too big. We had too many people in it. It was really don't worry about all that kind of stuff. Anyway, he died the following week because he actually tried to turn the car around in a place where, like Gail was just describing, a place in the middle. And he actually pulled off the ice road into a place that he thought was secure, and it actually was soft ice, and he went through. This is a guy who did this as a living. He drove on this ice all the time. And part of the problem is that the problem with climate change is the results are completely unpredictable. It's not just a shorter season. It actually might be real warming in the middle. In January, you're going to have a warming spell, and you think there's 18 inches or 24 inches of ice, but it's actually down to 8. You don't know that until you actually go through. So connectivity, absolutely a huge issue, creates all sorts of interesting challenges. If you have a chance to work with the Inuit, they actually do travel an awful lot. They travel within the communities themselves. They travel internationally. They're very, very engaged globally. When you go into the airports, the brand new airport in Nunavut, or in Iqaluit, of all the places in the world you build an airport that actually had one of those runways to get you from the plane into the building, they don't have one. Brand new airport doesn't have a runway. What do they call those things? The sky bridge into the terminal. So, we arrived there in Iqaluit, and it was in, when was that, about early April. It was about 27 below when you get off there. And I'd packed my coat in my suitcase. It's a really good place for a coat. And he said, okay, I'm not going to have to walk outside. I pretended I was being tough. And I said, well, I'm from the Yukon, I can handle this. No, stupid idiot. Next time I'll take my coat. Anyway, interesting. Anybody have quick questions about Nunavut? Very interesting development, and so do pay attention to it as it comes along. I want to sort of try to get back a little bit on track. We won't force the class into sort of too many boxes today, but I want us to break into our groups.
Real quick?
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, it's Brad. I don't know if you guys can, but I just wanted to say thank you very much for talking about all this. I missed some of the parts with the arts and the soapstone carving and the snowmobile stories earlier. That was the signal problem. But overall, very, very interesting to hear your discussion and all the points. So just thanks very much.
Oh, you're more than welcome. More than welcome. And I think it's one of those things that is an important part of how we understand Indigenous affairs in Canada. And this one is one that you're going to see up an awful lot in the national news. So what I want you to do in breaking into your groups is I want you to talk about the question of the primary obligations of government, broadly defined. So you notice I had federal, provincial, territorial, and Indigenous. And I'm giving you sort of 4 options. And please pick one, and don't say all of them, and don't say some measure and some mix. I just want to get a sense of what is the primary obligation. Is it to create equality of opportunity for all people so that everybody has the same chance to compete in the economy? Is the government's responsibility to provide basic infrastructure and let the economy build off of that? Is it government's obligation to ensure equality of outcomes? And have a broad definition here that doesn't necessarily mean money. It may mean money. It might mean, sort of well-being, material well-being, but also social well-being. In other words, people have decent equality of outcomes for all citizens. Or is it to simply guarantee that no members of society experience abject poverty? In other words, we're going to set a bottom line on where this is, but it's not equality or quality of opportunity. So just take 10 minutes in your groups. Talk through this question of what you think the fundamental role of government is. I find this interesting in teaching at Johnson Sayama and teaching political science and stuff over the years that we sometimes forget to ask the really basic questions. And then you discover in a class like this that we have quite sharp differences of opinions about the role of government. And sometimes we're ideological, sometimes it's just our value system, sometimes it's our experience. And you sort of all of a sudden discover you have completely different understandings of sort of what the fundamental role of government is in terms of economic development. And we'll have that conversation. I did ask a second question at the end, and that's about economic well-being of Indigenous peoples. So answer the first one first. This is about government for Canada as a whole, for citizens as a whole. And then answer the second one about are there any obligations to do special things to intervene on it for Indigenous folks. Okay? So it's just about 10:15, so we'll give you until 10:30 to talk about those two questions, okay? Thanks, everybody. We'll mute our phones here for the folks on WebEx and turn it back over to you.
Okay. So can everyone hear?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm thinking that if it's not bad on this end, then we don't need to use the chat section. But if it's still pretty spotty, then maybe we could go back to chat. But I posted what I think, as did Brad. Quinn, I see that you answered the second discussion question, which is good because I didn't even know this one was one. But what do you guys think?
I'm just reading what you guys wrote. So, equal outcomes, Candace, is it?
Yeah, so it's in the class 5 resource development notes, and I didn't actually see it as being like a class discussion question, but we have to choose one of the 4 obligations, and I chose the third point.
Where?
Yeah, I think that's a good one, and Brad agreed with you, it looks like, too.
Yeah, where was we didn't, 3 of us from you, Regina, didn't get the notes. Then you sent them at the same time Ken sent them there, Quinn. And then the links that I have in the syllabus, the Brian Crowley and the Greg.
Yeah.
None of those worked, right?
Yeah, but the
none of those work.
the final one did for me. The First Nations engagement in natural resource sector that went through. But I if you could sort of maybe get us up to date there, Quinn, on because or Candace or Gail, just based on I answered the question there, Candace, just based on my own personal opinion, equality of outcomes and opportunity. But
Yeah.
maybe you guys could sort of brief us a little bit.
So with the links, like I just looked them up because I couldn't get them either. I think some of the links do have like context in what we're discussing, but I'm also kind of confused in the links versus what we're talking about in a way. Did you get the Class 5 resource development notes that Ken sent out?
Is that the one that says Aboriginal people and natural resource development? Okay.
Yeah.
Got those this morning, and Pratt and Shikat, you got those as well, right?
Yeah, I got in the morning.
Okay, so
I see. So it's highlighted in bold.
Bold, and he usually puts being like, this is a discussion question. So if you scroll below, actually, there's one that says, this is a discussion. So I actually didn't know that like this part was actually going to be talked about among us. I thought the other one would be. So this is kind of like new for me too.
Okay, that's good. So we've all got, and Gail, I guess you're there as well. We've got on the end of the first page there, it says, in terms of the economy, primary obligation, as a question that he asked. So yeah, I mean, Candace, you and I have answered, and Quinn, I guess you answered. What does everyone else think?
I kind of have my personal opinion, but also from the readings, like one of the readings, Ken argues that, Aboriginal inclusion is essential, and that, it will result in financial autonomy, which will produce greater well-being and health for people. That's kind of the, I think, overarching statement of each one of those readings. But I've thought about this so much, and I've had so many discussions on it. You create equality of opportunity for all people. Okay, that sounds great. How are you going to do that? I don't know. There's so many government incentives and programs and models that have these awesome or fancy taglines like this, but when it comes to the practical, hands-on, boots on the ground application, they always fall short. So provide basic infrastructure for economic development. I think that's not necessarily the best approach. I think that could be the outcome of, say, something like ensuring equality of outcomes, or one of the other ones. I think that
sorry, Quinn, but I just want to ask, in which level of government are you speaking of? Are we speaking of federal, provincial, territorial, or indigenous? Because if we're going federal, then I can see that.
Yeah. Well, it says all. I guess this question refers to all four.
All four.
Where I'm getting at is you need to create the capacity.
Capacity, right?
For the cities to almost create, the equivalent of a socio-technical niche where they're protected. They have the capital, and the government invests in capital for them, where they are seen as kind of shareholders in the economic development that takes place in the region. And then through that, you create the tools, and then you create the self-sufficiency, and you create, without that, you just can't be competitive, because there's already dominant, regimes that are in place that, unless you are kind of given an opportunity or an advantage, you can't compete with. So capacity, and that's where I think ensuring equality of outcomes may be the best place to start.
So point 1 and point 3 are pretty much similar then. like equal opportunity of all people and ensure equality of outcomes in terms of income and material well-being and citizens. Those two would pretty much go together. Then they're pretty much similar.
I think so.
If you want,
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, we can join these two, like combine these both of these 2 points.
And I think when it comes to like discussing federal, provincial, territory, and Indigenous, I'm not sure if he wants us to separate it by government or if he just means like the primary objective of government as a whole. What does everyone else think about that?
well, whether we go federal, provincial, territorial, or Indigenous, points 1 and 3 would fit right into any one of them. So if we have to pick a different level, it would pretty much be the same. But from an Indigenous perspective, like for First Nations on a local reserve, we also have to look at because of the Indian Act, infrastructure also plays a role in that area as well. So depending on which level of government you're looking at, it's interesting because coming from a First Nations perspective, a lot of the funding is controlled by the Indian Act and what is distributed to each community, and it's based on population size. So that is interesting because when you look at this, at what's important, like infrastructure is important because of the overcrowding of housing, lack of water treatment plants, inadequate schools, and things like that. So you're kind of wondering, okay, what are we looking at? But if you wanted to say in the general perspective, I would say point 1 and point 3.
Point 1 and 3.
I agree. I'm thinking about it a little bit more, and I think the big difference between 1 and 3 is 1, say, for example, all of us wanted to have some opportunity. We all live in the same community. We want some opportunity to start our own company company. Then it would ensure that we all have equal access to in competitive with one another in starting that company. The point 3 is, say there's the companies that are already in place, like say oil and gas development. It would be almost like a profit sharing of those revenues from the companies and the business activities that are already in place that would be distributed evenly amongst the community. So it would ensure that community members who aren't engaged in economic development or activities receive are seen as shareholders and receive a portion of the profits split among community members. Whereas the first one, it would be anybody could engage or have opportunity to engage in economic development programs for their ideas. That's the main difference that I could see.
Yeah, and I could see that too, Quinn, because when you look at point 3, let's use Saskatchewan, for example, when they were talking about the elections and resource sharing, the Indigenous communities they approached the government, and this was in the news in regards to wanting to share resource development up north. But Brad Wall plain out said, no, there was no resource sharing with Indigenous people. So that would affect how point 3 is set up. And I can see that when I look at your scenario of how you explained it.
So in that case, would given the reality of the present and that you have these big corporations who are extracting resources and getting them to market, and the shareholders don't live in the community, but they're reaping the majority of the profits, would not providing a restructuring of how that resource wealth is distributed and ensuring that the local communities have a place and get some of the shares be a good starting point that would eventually lead to equal opportunity for all people? So part 3, if you could ensure that, maybe the first step in getting to part 1, part 2, and part 4. Like do you know what I mean?
Yep, makes sense. I agree with what you're saying.
That's kind of some justification to that one, I guess. It kind of would lead to all the others. Whereas if you start with infrastructure, which is what they've done up here in northern BC through the Northern Development Initiative Trust, they've spent over close to $300 million in the last little while investing in economic development, but all they've done is built infrastructure, and that hasn't created any economic any heightened economic capacity in the region. So it's still, we have new hospitals and new rec centers, but it's still, in terms of the shareholders for these resource extraction, it's still the status quo. So nothing's really changed in terms of economic development. We're still boom and bust economy, but we have these new fancy facilities. So and higher speed, but it hasn't really resulted in anything. Whereas you got to distribute opportunity among the people, and then once you are wealthy as a community, then you can build your own infrastructure. I don't. You need basic infrastructure, but I don't know. I think that follows.
Yep. No, that's really well articulated there. I think that's in not just the remote communities, but that's everywhere, right? Lay the ground rules, and then slowly but surely hand things off to the private sector.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
especially when I was living in British Columbia, it's interesting to see that like their infrastructure is a lot better than where I am in Ontario, but it's true, it never really created anything else, right? It never took that step.
It's so frustrating because you have people up here that go bananas over jobs and the labor market, but they're not even thinking about capital or capacity or the future. And then you have this 5-year cycle in which the construction phase of some major industrial project employs a lot of people, and then the real estate market gets inflated. The infrastructure gets, tons of pressure, but then everyone leaves when it's done. The economy dips, and everybody's trying to pay their mortgage and can't. So it's like, and then all the profit goes to the shareholders who live somewhere
Somewhere
else.
else. Yeah, we had houses that were like $1 million each, and we were literally in the middle of nowhere. But the people who own the houses were in China. But like I said, like we were in the middle of nowhere in a northern BC. Like there wasn't anything near us. So it's interesting to see that, right?
I
It just makes everything go up higher.
I lived and worked in Fort St. John for a year, and then I've also
Hey, I did too. That's where I lived.
really.
Yeah.
New Brunswick?
No, British Columbia, Fort St. John.
Yeah. Shy Cat, you were in New Brunswick.
Yeah,
Weigh in
there's
on
a
this.
St. John in New Brunswick too.
No, we were in Fort St. John in BC. But what are your opinions though? Like you lived in New Brunswick, they got some challenges in that province. What do you weigh in on this? What do you think?
I see. I didn't even know this thing existed when I was there. I just came in Canada, and I lived there for 4 months. So I had no idea about this. Brett, what are you asking exactly about indigenous issues there in New Brunswick?
No. Just in general, what we're talking about, the discussion question in terms of the economy and sort of the points that Quinn and Gail and Candice and everybody's sort of gone over with those 4 points. Prab, I know you had spoke on the chat there, but what are your opinions, Shy Cat?
No, I see. It was 2005. Like I was an international student, and I just did 1 semester there, so I don't know much about St. John.
Okay, but what in terms of our discussion, just in general, what are your thoughts?
Yeah. So in my country, I was talking to Prabjot about this. In my country, we have this indigenous issue as well. So in 1998, our government actually our situation was worse than this because we were literally fighting. Our military was fighting with like they formed their own militants. It was very bad. So in 1998, we had this peace agreement with our indigenous people. So they surrendered their weapons, and then government gave them incentives like in government jobs and universities, schools, they had quota. And still now they have this quota just to engage themselves in the government, you know. And I think that worked pretty good because when you actually start working for the government, then you get a better idea how the government is working. So I think that's another way to bring them together. But for this economic development, you need sustainable development, right? If you just invest in a thing which does not produce later on, it's not good investment.
Yeah, good. So are we all then in agreement that what I'm getting, Quinn and Candice, Gail, Prab, Shaikat, is that we're saying,
Okay,
hey,
everybody.
start.
Let's
Please go ahead and speak for us, or Candice.
let's form up again.
Quinn, do you want to speak up for us this time?
So
Only if no one else does.
easy question this time around. Straightforward. Yes, no kind of answers.
Better than some.
What's that?
Better than some of your questions.
Yeah. Well, the purpose of this question is to sort of try to get you to figure out your own value system. This isn't there's no right or wrong answer. These are the different options. The different options that are here sort of cover the entire spectrum of sort of political organizations. And so there's a huge amount of as we sort of go along. So let's start with your group first.
So we disagreed, so we're not giving you one answer, but we kind of are. So 3 of us agreed that for the first part of the question, create equality of opportunity for all people.
Okay. And the center was?
Well, I didn't agree with them. I feel that the government should provide basic infrastructure for economic development. The reason why I think about this is that infrastructure costs a lot of money, and it's needed for almost every society. You need schools, you need hospitals, you need roads. And once you have that infrastructure in place, people are able to find opportunities to do other things. Case in point, I come from a fourth world country. We don't have lights at night because we can't afford electricity, but somebody donated some solar panels, and suddenly there's light at night. Now people are like, oh, I can run my business until this time. Oh, we can have certain activities until this time. Those opportunities were not there before that infrastructure was there. So if we do have the infrastructure in place, the opportunities will flow with that.
Okay. Some people call that the field of dreams approach. If you build it, and they will come. Other people say that it's the only thing government does well. The government can do infrastructure. The other pieces are far more complicated. I think I heard that Quinn was going to speak for the WebExers.
It's going to be me. We
wonderful.
thought that like the third point, so ensure equality of outcomes for all, was like the one that we picked. We distinctly spoke about how if you provide infrastructure for economic development, sometimes that doesn't actually provide consistent economic development, right? Like an infrastructure can, from start to end, be a few years. So what's going to happen after that few years, after it's built, type thing.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Group over in the corner here.
Yeah, we had the same arguments, and I don't think there was consensus in our group. And I think my experience was that each of the 4 at one time, one or all of us were supportive of it, and then after some discussion, we weren't supportive of it any longer. I think at the very, very end, we kind of, some of us maybe acquiesced and thought the third one as well. What confused us with the third one, which led to a bit of discussion, was the focus on, or the difference between material well-being and outcomes related to sort of social. So health and education and things like that versus, everybody gets a TV. Or the reverse being that, so, do we have some very wealthy and very successful people? Does that mean that they have to drop significantly to make other people come up? And is that an issue?
Okay, wonderful. Who hasn't spoken yet?
We had some. We had a great discussion, and it's interesting that you guys chose some of the ones we ruled out equality of outcomes right away because we thought individual people. At some point you need to do some work for yourself. So we just ruled off outcomes, and we didn't really discuss abject poverty either. So we had quite a bit of discussion between creating equality of opportunity and providing basic infrastructure. And then, so we kind of went, so providing basic infrastructure, we didn't have the idea of like, they will build it and they will can't like build some sort of work opportunity, and then, or do you expect the people to be trained? If they have nobody to work there, is that really a good option? And then we thought that including equal opportunity for all people includes things like jobs, health, but also as a lesser included item instead of lesser included offense. The lawyer in the group used this term. Could provide basic infrastructure would be included in the equal opportunity for all.
Oh, by doing one, you get the other.
Yeah, that's how we are going to argue that.
Okay. So just as best you can, really quickly, relate a political party to each of these in Canada.
Guarantee that no members of society experience abject poverty would be New Democratic. More centrist would be equality of outcomes, but also be New Democratic, but also more liberal as well. Basic infrastructure was also more liberal, where equality of opportunity would likely be more conservative and more right-leaning. The spectrum is more 3D more than anything. It's not like a single plane. But equality of opportunity is definitely more of a Tory idea.
So why wasn't this easy?
Because you had to pick one.
No, but just in the sense that economic development, whether it's regardless of your other feelings about other things, absolutely foundational. People have to eat. They have to have work. They have to have opportunities, right? And so you look at this and you think, okay, well, this is the obvious answer. Why was it not an obvious answer?
We have different value systems.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And sometimes you discover, you guys didn't get into it as much. I'm not sure if the folks on WebEx got into it as much in the same way. These things are very visceral, right? Sometimes you look at this and you think, ensure equality of outcomes. That's communism.
Yeah, that's what we said.
Well, that's kind of what we discussed too. Like, it was really hard to choose one because, as Quinn pointed out, that is kind of communism. But that's how it rolls, right?
That's who you are. You're all commies, right? I mean, and to be fair, Social Democrats sort of come to sort of the same idea, and Social Democrats believe in sort of lowering the band. So if you look at the United States, in the United States now, the top 0.1% of Americans own the same amount of American wealth as 90% of the rest of the population. 0.1%. Tiny number of people. And that's interesting because politically that's become a big issue. The real issue, I think, is far more substantial, is not that one. Because that way you can look at the Walmarts of the world and Bill Gates of the world. Bill Gates of the world doesn't think about money at all. He's worth billions upon billions of dollars. The money he has in his casual account will actually cover everything he needs to spend for the rest of his life. And this is all paper money. It's all the companies that he's created and all that sort of stuff, right? The ones you have to worry about, including many of the people in this room now or in the future, are the 10%. Because the 0.1% are the people who are the innovators, the creators, the risk takers, the crooks and the criminals. They get their money in a whole bunch of different ways, but they're a tiny group of people, and they're all outliers. The 10% are the people who are the most talented, most creative, some risk-taking as well. And that's actually the group that is breaking apart from the rest of Western society. Forget about the 0.1. We've already always had those. You used to call them kings and queens and monarchs and oligarchs and all these kind of stuff, right? What's really happening in North America is the 10% are breaking away. And these are doctors and all that kind of stuff, right? And university professors. And they separate out from the group and are actually losing social contact. If you look across North America, there's something like, I think the United States has 5 million people living in gated homes. And basically, don't let anybody else in. You go through, then some of them have armed guards sitting at the gates. What is this scary stuff, right? So, interesting watching this value system arise, because part of the other side of it is, I work harder than other people, I should have more money. I don't want leveling it off. You folks haven't done as much work as I've done, so you're not as wealthy as I am yet. Tough on you. Good luck. If you work hard, you'll get ahead, kind of stuff. Which, of course, is actually not enough. There's an awful lot of people who work extremely hard, are just in the wrong circumstances, wrong background, face discrimination. For generations, it was women who worked harder and were smarter and did all the other things, and they were still broken off, which is kind of an intriguing sort of piece. Let's go back on the second question. For obligations to Indigenous people, I'm not sure if everybody had a chance to answer that, so we'll go in reverse order.
The second question?
Yeah, I noticed you folks.
We didn't have time to get into this very much, but I spoke of a case study I had written a few years ago on the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline. And the question was whether the federal or provincial government should do more to make sure that project succeeded because the Aboriginals had such a huge stake in it.
Yep.
And that's as far as we got. But I think the government should do something to help these projects succeed because there's such a huge stake in it.
Yep. Yep. Okay, Jocelyn, quickly.
We should get out of the way.
Government should get out of the way. Well, there's an idea. WebEx, folks?
So we didn't address this question either, but just from my own experience from working with government on projects, I find that the measures that they have that are apparently supposed to intervene and help the economic well-being of Indigenous people doesn't actually work. And as Jocelyn said, I feel like sometimes government should just get out of the way because Indigenous people already know exactly like the land, they know exactly what's going on and they know what they need and they know what they don't need. But I find when government intervenes, it's like we tell them what they need and we tell them what they don't need. It's like, well, it doesn't really work, right?
Yep, interesting question. In a public policy, really interesting question. Go ahead, is that Gail?
I agree with what Candace is saying as well. When you look at Indigenous groups and when it comes to what our needs are, the governments need to step aside because there's so much red tape that you have to go through, and it takes forever. I work for the government. I work for the government of Saskatchewan, and I work in the justice area, and we're getting policies, we're getting programs, we're told how to do our job and what First Nations people need, but nobody's listening to what Indigenous people need.
Yep.
And there's so much red tape to go through. Like I agree with what Candace is saying. Like they got to step aside and let us do what we need to do, and just support us through it.
Salmon School of Energy.
Exactly. Yeah.
I love it. I love it. I agree with a lot of what you're saying. It's interesting watching that sentiment get stronger and stronger as we sort of go along. There's hands flying up all over the place.
Yeah, I suggested that the government should only intervene if they're asked to. So the solutions are coming from the communities and not the government imposing their solution on the people. So unless they're asked to, then they should just step back.
Your group, you're an outlier. You're the one that only wants to put on the lights if they ask to have the lights put on, right? So you've been an outlier. The rest of the group here are a bunch of social democrats and communists, right? You want to have equality of outcomes, and so you said to them, well, but if you believe that, then in fact you're driven by government to create policies that will produce that, right? Which then leads you to sort of income redistribution and things of that sort. Just a small example: the federal government sort of started doing some tax breaks on people with private corporations. I have a private corporation. I do my consulting work and stuff. My daughter-in-law is a doctor. She is a private corporation, and it didn't matter to me because I have a regular sort of job, so it isn't a big issue, not a big part of my life. In my daughter-in-law's case, everything she's planned for since she went to medical school was thrown out the window by one silly government proposal. And she's all of a sudden, my plans for my retirement are thrown out the window, my savings plans, everything I've been doing. My whole business model is thrown out the window. And because the government thought, we're going to take a bunch of money from these lazy doctors and university professors who are hiding it from taxpayers and suck it back into the system and redistribute it. And if you're on the receiving end, you think, yes, those doctors get paid too much. The university professors are massively overpaid. Therefore, we should redistribute it. It's interesting watching the little clash between value systems, which you really want to see. In all honesty, what we actually do want to see is equality of outcomes. Don't we? Don't you really want to see your next door neighbor has a good life? As long as you have a good life? As long as his good life or her good life doesn't come at your expense? Right? So what's probably the most successful middle-class country in the world? Not the ones with extremes of wealth here and back in, but just a really good middle-class country. Where would you think it would be?
Swiss?
It's actually Japan. Actually, Japan. Japan used to have really strict rules that like the owner of Sony, the president of Sony, could only make 5 times more than the owner than the top employee. They don't change that quite a bit now. But you have the person who runs Ontario Hydro at $6 million a year. These are staggering sums. You had a quick observation.
We also have, there are direct ways of intervention and there are many indirect ways. And that's important to acknowledge the difference. So when we look at the social economy, most of that is done through grant funding to societies that will do that and help those who are in the abject poverty situation. That's not a direct intervention. That's through other methods. And it's important to acknowledge that that does have an economic and social situation.
Absolutely. Very good point. Yeah.
And part of our discussion too included defining that equality of opportunity, because what is one opportunity for you might not be the same as the opportunity for you, my colleague across the table. I might need something else to help create that level of equality, that same playing field to advance. So who's defining that and then providing resources and support to help do that? So that was also a very important aspect that we were wrestling with as well.
Wrestling is a good description. It is really hard, isn't it? There's no easy answers to all of this because, one person is carrying a weight of history on their shoulders because of their ethnicity. And their challenge of having equality of opportunity is there. Somebody else is because of gender, because of sexual orientation, because of where they live in the country. Equality of opportunity in Prince Edward Island is radically different than Vancouver. In Vancouver, British Columbia, if you want to find a job, you just go outside and say, I'm willing to find some work. Jobs are really easy to find there. Prince Edward Island, they're not. And so there's a whole bunch of things that factor into these things that take it away from being easy. Any other last thoughts on this? Yep.
So I agree with that. The government should just get out of the way sometimes. One of the biggest downfalls of the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline project was that it took 6 years to get approval. And by then the economy had changed and it wasn't viable anymore. So when I say that the government should do something to help these projects succeed, I'm not saying they should decide what's best and come in and impose it. It might be as simple as cutting red tape so that they can get going.
Yep. Well, the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline, which I talked about a little bit, was a situation that would have been 30% owned by Aboriginal folks, was the only chance in a generation to actually give these communities a real future. Why did it fall apart? Yes, it's called red tape and a bunch of other things. It's also environmental intervention. The environmentalists went crazy on the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline, wanted more studies and more studies, and they dragged it out and dragged it out. They get very defensive when you say that. Well, we have to protect the environment, and the First Nations reaction was, we'll protect the environment. We don't need a biologist from the University of Alberta telling us how to run our local ecology. We'll do it ourselves.
Well, it's just really difficult because Canada's not going to look like a great place to do business, and companies can start moving elsewhere.
We've probably lost $50 to $100 billion of investment capital in Canada since the 2015 election. And, sometimes that's a good thing because they're going too fast on certain projects. And I'm not making it sound simple. It's actually really complicated. But these things have consequences. So let's take a break. We've lost our schedule a little bit because let's take a 15-minute break so to catch up. I want you to come back, and I want this done really quickly this time. I want you to go very, very quickly through and tell me your government program that you think has been successful. You must think of one federal government program that you think has been successful. And we're just going to go right around the room, and you're not going to explain anything. You're just going to give me the name of a federal government program that you think has been successful. Okay? Sound good? Easy? What's that? Would have been successful? No, it's got to have been implemented. No, it might have been. Which one are you thinking about? Yes. Oh, Ken Coates calling you back. Oh, who's this? Oh, good. I haven't heard from you for a long time. How you doing, my friend? Wonderful. Wonderful. Oh, wonderful. Wonderful. No. Joe, what? No, I don't. Nope. Nope, I don't, sorry. Yep, I'm here. I can hear you. Yep. Screen at each other over the phone here. Try it again. Joe Cult. Oh, okay, yeah, okay, I know the name now. Yep. 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 Great, great. Yep. Fantastic, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely, love it. Absolutely. Count me in. I said, count me in. Okay. Yep. Oh, fabulous. Yep, yep. Oh, that sounds great. Let me work on it and get it back to you right away, and we'll have more talks, okay? Yep. Yep. Oh, okay. Oh, neat. Wow. That is neat. All right, I'm on it. I'll work on it and get back to you as soon as I can. Yep. 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 Oh, wow. That's fantastic. Well, and I sure need some, eh? I say I need a boost. Okay. Well, this is great. Fantastic. It does. That's amazing. Yep. Oh, that'd be astonishing. I'm in. Yep. Excellent. Sound good? Okay. Okay. I'll get something to you on the weekend, okay? Yeah, this is huge. You have those contacts that gets things racing ahead. I like that too. Yep. Yep. Fantastic. Well done. Okay, take care. Bye-bye. That's so healthy, sitting and eating grapefruit. Father used to eat grapefruits all the time, and I could never bring myself to eat them ever.
What? Type for you or something? I also just like eating raw onions sometimes. Really? Kind of burn the stomach.
Really? Holy moly, that'll get your blood going.
Yeah. It's also like this basic. Yeah, I don't eat them.
Don't want to eat those in class, hey?
But onions. One of the things that I find interesting with that last conversation you're all having is that we have so much empirical evidence about what works and doesn't work, and we don't use it. You know, so we all have this conversation as though what we think matters. And the interesting thing, even from a public policy or governance perspective, is it actually doesn't matter what you think. It matters what you know works and in what circumstances things work. And I always find it so fascinating. So we just use an example. And this is not, I'm actually pretty much on the pro-infrastructure side in terms of providing the basic infrastructure. But the government of Canada in the 1950s, John Diefenbaker, was elected in 1957 on a platform of opening up the north. Now, he wasn't doing this because he wanted to help Aboriginal folks, but he was doing it because he wanted to open up the north and create sort of a new frontier in Canada. And they started the Roads to Resources programs, which included railways and highways and electrical things and mine projects and things of that sort. And over the next 10 years, massive amounts of money spent. And if you go back there now, almost all of it's gone. Railways are closed down, the roads sort of gone to seed, the towns have disappeared. They built the towns up and then closed them down again. And his view was, instead of building the Trans-Canada Railway, build the railway and other things will flow. So it worked in the context of the prairies. It didn't work in the context of the north. And the question is, well, why? Well, they built too many roads in the wrong place and didn't go the right way and all that kind of stuff, right? And so there's reasons why you can go through and see why it didn't work. But I always find it fascinating when you watch every election. Watching the one in Ontario right now, which is driving me absolutely insane. Because the only way to vote is none of the above. You know, and you look at this thing and you think there's a complete absence of experience. You know, well, what worked and what didn't work? Why are we going down this path? Why should we do it different ways? So Ontario has done more to scare businesses out of this country than anybody you can imagine. It's just astonishing. And I used to work in Waterloo and in a high-tech sector. And the companies are they're just moving them, pulling up to their doors day after day to get out of Canada. Because they can't afford to work here anymore. And you know, you know that's happening, find another policy framework, another way of getting at the same thing. So, very interesting.
Sometimes I wonder how much fails just because they're like that 4-year time frame. You can't get reelected.
So if you look at an example, this is a huge philosophical debate. You say, well, what kind of government works the best? So here's two issues that I hope bother you a lot. Okay, so if you look around the world, the governments that are succeeding best in the 21st century are unicultural governments, unicultural countries. So Japan, South Korea, Singapore doesn't seem like it actually is a multicultural place, but they have a unifying ideology. Israel, unified around the idea of the state of Israel. Finland, unified by language and culture. And they have a very sort of singular focus because you're all the same. You have the same background, you have the same value system. Multicultural nations, the United States being a good example, Canada being a good example, Australia struggling in some ways. So how do you find a policy that incorporates everybody? Because you actually don't share the same value system. Western Canada doesn't share the value system with Quebec. And I'll tell you, if I've lived in the Maritimes, it doesn't share the value system at all with the Maritimes. How do you find a national policy that actually sort of incorporates everybody? And that one actually worries me, because I think we're a wonderfully multicultural nation, and it could be our strength. I don't believe what the Prime Minister says, diversity is our strength. Diversity is our reality, and it's a great reality, and some of it's strong and some of it's not so strong, and so let's work through that kind of thing, which is kind of interesting. The other side is that the countries that really work very successfully are benign dictatorships, where you actually have essentially real central strong people. And Korea said sometimes, Taiwan said sometimes like that. Singapore is the best example. And I don't know if you know about Singapore very much, but it has probably the highest paid civil service in the world. So they basically say, you're deputy minister of housing in Singapore. Housing, everybody, a lot of the housing is state-owned in Singapore. And you run an organization that's worth billions and billions of dollars. They're going to pay them $700,000 a year. In Canada, we would say, oh boy, that's terrible. We're going to pay them, $90,000 a year to run a $700 billion portfolio. So, well, no, I'll work in the private sector where I can run a $700 billion portfolio. So Singapore has actually worked really well, but it has essentially it's a benign dictatorship, one-party state. And because it's a one-party state that doesn't do nasty things, we're comfortable with it.
Yeah. But they can turn in an instant from
Oh,
being
absolutely.
benign dictatorship to being malignant.
Sure they can. In the same way that a democratic country can turn from being sort of social democratic to populist in the 2016 election. Yeah, exactly. And you can have Nutbar case running everything, right? And doing some interest. I was listening to, I don't know if anybody else have Sirius Radio? Sirius XM Radio? This is the satellite radio system. So my logic in life is that I spend my entire day immersed with extremely smart, motivated students and extremely smart, motivated faculty, and I read all this scholarly stuff. So when I'm on the radio, I want dumb. So I listen to sports, baseball, football, all this kind of stuff, right? And I don't want any more. My brain is going to explode in 1,000 pieces. So I deliberately listen to something called Patriot Radio in the United States, which is extreme right-wing radio. And you listen to these things and you think, I can't believe you're alive. I can't believe you're able to put your pants on. You're so dumb, right? And I'm being too critical. They are very, very right-wing, very evangelical sort of Christians, right?
I've listened to some of that.
Have you listened to some?
We went through a road trip through the States, and we'd always listen to the community radio station.
Yeah.
Oh, it's so fun.
It's amazing. And then you listen to Howard Stern, who was the first $100 million person a year person in the media. These guys are crazy people, talking about crazy, crazy things. And that's the other side, right? So there's a constituency out there for that sort of view. And it makes you actually undemocratic. When I listen to people phoning to talk shows, I sit there and think, I can't believe you have the same vote I do. I spend my entire life thinking about government policy, trying to be as thoughtful as I can, trying to be as evidence-based, trying to make things figured out. What did you do?
Alex Bridget.
Holy yeah. Clearly, next time, agree with what he had to say. Anyway, it is really fascinating because just listening to Americans talk about politics, you think, how can you be in that same world? Guns, for example. I don't know how much time you spend in the United States, but talking to Americans about guns is just the most remarkable thing. And I'm a gun owner. I've had guns around me my whole life. I like them, respect them, and everything else. Talking to a student when we were in Japan with a student in my wife's class, and this guy was talking about the AK-47s that he owned. And he'd actually raced out the family gun and bought an extra 10 AK-47s because California's putting restrictions on them. And so goodness knows you can't have enough AK-47s in your house. They're machine guns, right? Just unbelievable.
10 kids just died this morning in Houston.
No. Another school shooting?
In Houston?
Texas.
How many?
10, I think, so far.
The last time I checked, Houston, in Texas there's 23 different kinds of murder in Canada that are not punishable as murder in Texas. So if you are in Texas and you walk into a bedroom and your partner is in bed with somebody else and you shoot them both, you will not be charged with murder.
Are you serious?
Don't try and find out. Let's do that in Canada and Texas and see what happens to me, right? They have in Canada we have what's called duty to retreat. So if you all of a sudden got really mad at me and jumped up and you have had a knife and I have a gun and you're threatening me right now, right? In Canada, my legal obligation is to go out that door. And if I sit there and I tell you to calm down and you don't calm down, okay, fine, I'm going to shoot you. Sorry to even pretend that. That actually, I'm guilty of murder. I have a duty, as long as there's a door there, right? So if I come after you and the corner is right behind you and there's no place for you to retreat, you can shoot me because you don't have an opportunity to retreat. And so we had these big court cases all the time. There was a guy in Calgary who shot somebody who was a thief in the store, armed robbery in the store. And a guy pulled out a gun and he shot him, I think with a shotgun, right? And he was actually found guilty. Now, he wasn't given a very big sentence because everybody was on his side, but he was found guilty because he actually had not retreated. He had not avoided the conflict situation. So in Texas...
Has he heard of Gerald's
I was
family?
going to say that only applies if you're indoors, apparently, not outdoors on a farm.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it does apply out there. That's an interesting case, is all of that. But in the United States, you have no duty to retreat. So if you could burnish a knife at me and sort of, I'm going to get you, I can shoot like that. So my favorite story was I was in New Orleans one time, and this guy, somebody broke into his house and was rolling around obviously trying to find money. And the guy woke up upstairs and, hey, go to my house. So the guy was in his house, left the house. Okay, so there's no longer a threat or a danger. He had a rifle in his hand. He walked out on the street. The guy was running down the middle of the street, and he shot him in the back. And the only question was which award he would get. He wasn't found guilty. He wasn't even charged with murder. In Canada, you would have been charged with murder and been found guilty with murder. Anyway, so you're planning to get rid of a spouse who's cheating, take them to Texas. Get off.
On a vacation and rekindle our relationship.
Yeah. You're saying that with way too much of a smile on your face. Okay, I got to get our colleagues back on the line.
Ken, I can hear you.
Oh, okay, you're all
I can hear you, Ken. Yep.
Oh, okay, good. I thought I muted you before. Sorry about that.
We've been listening to your conversation, and I don't think I want to be going to Texas because I'm happily married right now.
Yes, well, just check your partner really carefully before you go down. So I wanted you to really quickly, no editorial comment, tell me the government program that you think has been successful. Nothing? Okay.
Immigration and Syrian refugees.
You're responsible for that, aren't you?
Partially.
Yes. Okay.
The interim federal health program.
The which one?
Interim.
Okay.
I don't know how to say that word.
Interim, yeah. Okay. Interesting, okay. GIS?
Guaranteed income.
Oh, guaranteed income supplement, okay. Extra money for seniors, basically, right?
Old age security.
Old age security, yeah.
I thought of immigration as compared to America.
Immigration, but not this year. Not this year. The refugees coming into the country are going to cause an enormous conflict.
Not in terms of refugees, in terms
Yep,
of
regular refugee, yep.
In terms of people coming to work and having
Yep.
a pathway to use.
Yep. Canada's got a good system that way. You like the old age pension. I'm glad because you're going to be paying mine.
Child tax benefit.
Child tax benefit, okay.
Public liquor stores?
Smiling on that one too. Finding out an awful lot about you. Well, it's good to have a nurse in the crowd.
I thought of retirement too, but I'll say something different. Education tax credits.
Education
Those
tax.
have been clawed up
Yeah.
recently.
Yeah, they used to be very handsome. I used to, but 3 years ago, if my daughter, who's 17, had gone to university, the net cost of her going to university was zero. By the time you look at all the different tax breaks that were available to me, and the kind of tax brackets and all that kind of stuff, she could have gone to the University of Saskatchewan, and the net cost to me was zero, which is not what they had in mind. Why they called them back?
Smoking cessation.
Smoking cessation. You know what they did in New Zealand about smoking? The smoking companies used to subsidize all the sports and all the cultural events. And so one of the big arguments against sort of banning smoking, advertising, is that of course all these events would disappear. So you had the symphony saying, "Please don't cancel their advertising license because we're going to lose our Du Maurier symphony series, and they give us $100,000 a year." So what New Zealand said, "This is really great. What we're going to do is we're going to tax all the smoking companies for the same level of money." So they were getting 5% of their money on advertising. We're going to take 5% off, and we're going to call all these events smoke-free. So now it's a smoke-free symphony series, right? And the smoke-free racing series, and the smoke-free basketball series, right? It's kind of rubbing it in double ways. So they have to pay for it. Smoking companies pay for it, but they get the anti-advertising, which is, I love New Zealand. It's great.
I was thinking old age security and GIS as well.
Old age security, okay.
Gail
Very-
here.
Yep.
The Northern Health Benefit Program for Status First Nations people.
Okay. Makes it possible to head south and get proper treatment. Yep. Jocelyn?
Passports.
Passports. Another government enthusiast here. Yes. Okay. Who else is on the phone?
I was thinking NHB as well, even though it's flawed.
Okay. All right.
I don't know much, but recently what I heard about is about these health programs.
Okay. We have an interesting thing around health programs that Canadians, when they're asked to identify what it means to be Canadian, they often talk about the healthcare system. Our healthcare system is currently ranked about 21st in the world. We're actually not doing very well at it. And many other countries have actually figured out how to balance private and public health, but we have an ideological hang-up on that, which is kind of an interesting issue. Okay. Who else do we miss on the phone? Haven't heard from
First
Brad.
Nations
Go ahead.
Education Transformation.
Sorry, say that again?
First Nations Education Transformation Engagement Program. It's from 2016 to 2018.
Okay. I didn't know the specifics of that one, but that's a engagement transformation. Okay, good. Who's next?
It's Brad here.
Yep.
I'm going to say the home renovation tax credit.
I agree.
Okay. And we haven't heard from Quinn. I'm sure it's something to do with fishing.
Well, recently they just closed. No, it's not a program, but yeah. Anyway, fishing. No, I don't want to talk about fishing right now. They just closed the Skeena fishery for sports fishermen. It's the first time ever. But anyway, I'm sure there are people living in remote and rural communities who would disagree with healthcare being a good program, but if you look at, I don't know, I think there's some good things there too.
So you're going to stick with the healthcare one. So it's interesting. That's an interesting range of things. A lot of them, almost a third of you pick your own pension fund. You know, you sort of worry about those kind of protectives down the line. They've actually been very successful. It's interesting that I don't know the exact numbers, so don't quote me on this, but about 20% of people who retire actually have an increase in their standard of living when they retire. You always think of retirement as being, go off into poverty. Well, actually, people who are living poorly, when they get to that point, there's a whole bunch of other benefits that kick in, pharmacare coverage and all those sort of things. So the retirement is often a sort of a saving grace for people who are 65, 70 years of age. So it's interesting that you sort of look at that sort of life safety kinds of things, and you add in the healthcare stuff. It's interesting. I thought I didn't say anything on purpose. I'm struck by, with the sole exception of public liquor stores, which is really about government getting away from. You like publicly funded ones or privately ones? You couldn't think of anything else. That it's interesting how even though we're on a conversation about economic development, you didn't put any economic development ones down on your list of things. And it's kind of an interesting issue. There was a really interesting study done in the United States a while back where they were simply asked the question of, are government programs successful? Do they produce the outcomes that they intended to do? Number one, most government programs don't have clear outcomes. They don't really say what they expect to happen. Secondly, they are not research-based. So government programs are not going back and say, what does the research tell us is the best thing to do? They're kind of political gut-based. We just sort of did that ourselves here. Imagine if this was the federal cabinet and we were sitting down, talking about things, and we go through the discussions we had. We would have come up with a little bit of infrastructure development, a lot of equality of opportunity stuff, and we would have developed some programs, not necessarily research-based in terms of their foundations.
Well, a great example is the Canada Child Care Benefit. They said they lifted like 300,000 kids out of poverty, but that wasn't really true at all. So, but they just the way they could work the data.
They just take a number up and.
I know.
Yeah, so it's interesting to look. It's a friend of mine. If you go look if you read the National Post at all, if you type in Philip Cross is a former economic statistician for Stats Canada. He's retired, and now he writes all the things he wasn't really allowed to write when he was with Stats Canada. And he got really upset with the last election when we were talking about the middle class. Canada's middle class actually does quite well. And actually, we've been seeing an increase in the situation. The problem is people below the middle class who actually are really suffering. People in lower income, people who've fallen out of the middle class. There's large numbers that are there. And Japan, you probably heard of Japan talking about all of its economic challenges the last little while, and almost in real crisis. Japan's the only sort of middle class country in the world where the middle class have maintained their share of the national income. Japan is ferocious about maintaining the sort of a decent standard of living for the vast majority of people. And in Canada, we're actually getting into a situation where we're bifurcating, and then encouraging people who have money to leave. So a good friend of mine from Ontario, who's one of the tech people who runs one of the big companies out there, just left Ontario because he couldn't afford to stay there anymore. When he saw the last set of provincial taxes and things like that, he said, I'm going to be, in his case, he makes $2.5 million a year. Don't feel sorry for him for a second. And he was actually an early investor in Yahoo, when Yahoo was the early Google. So this guy made hundreds of millions. He's really, really, really rich. And he looked at this and said, do I want to keep working in Ontario so I can pay an extra, it was going to cost him an extra $250,000 a year. And moved to Alberta, right? So government policies have an impact on different people. And interesting from your point of view, you're really security-minded. Finding an awful lot about you. Remember yesterday, you're all very practical and pragmatic and middle of the road. Here you are again, you're very Canadian and very, let's worry about old age pensions, let's worry about health care, all that sort of stuff. The reality is we actually don't know whether our programs work. We don't actually have systematic data on whether housing programs work. You know we could build a house. You don't know if that actually had the positive outcomes you wanted to go with that house and better educational outcomes and things of that sort. I think I told you the story before about the Aboriginal training programs. We spend $300 million a year on Aboriginal training. Most of that money is outsourced. So sometimes it goes to colleges, polytechs, universities. Most of it goes to private companies that then arrange for training programs for people. Some of the most successful ones, those successful programs we've ever seen are wonderful to watch. There's one in northern Saskatchewan. It's called Norquest. Is that the right name? Norquest. Wonderfully successful. Hundreds of people a year. It's just beautifully structured. And Norquest, its funding was always year to year. Every year sort of applying for more money, waiting to hear. Sometimes they had to lay everybody off and then hire them back a month later when they actually got their funding through. But we actually, on a national scale, we do not know whether these things work. $300 million a year is spent on something and we don't know if it works. Is the unemployment rate going down? No. Are some people finding jobs? Yes. Are they finding jobs because of these training programs? We don't know. With one of the training programs they funded in the Northwest Territories, trained 20 people to be work in mines. And of the 20 people who were trained, one of them got a job in the mine. It wasn't the fault of the program. What happened is the mining industry had a downturn. And so people were training for jobs that didn't exist. So this is a really interesting sort of question. And on the economic development front, it's really critical. So we want to create economic opportunity. Nobody is really in favor of no prosperity, right? You might not want to go too whole hog. You might want to be sort of less materialistic about it. It doesn't mean everybody gets a big car and a big house and a big this and a big that. My wife, who's an unbelievably committed environmentalist who drives me crazy over plastic bags at grocery stores, and I'm always having to go back to this car and get the paper or the cloth bags and go back in and saying bad things about her as I go. Where she really feels ambivalent about this is she's also a world traveler. And she knows when you go in different places around the world that their economies are entirely based on energy and foreign tourists, right? So 8% of the world's carbon releases, greenhouse gases, are related to tourism, international tourism. 8%. And that's completely luxury, right? We don't actually have to go to the Cayman Islands. You don't have to go to Mexico for Christmas. So we could easily get rid of that. We could all go to Moose Jaw. I like Moose Jaw. Moose Jaw's a nice place. Moose Jaw, cool. Yeah. Well, I didn't say Kindersley. I said Moose Jaw, right? You all go to Moose Jaw, right? And we could solve the problems. 8%. That would be a huge reduction. How would you like to be somebody who lives in one of those communities, those countries that relies on tourism? They're extremely vulnerable, right? If you actually took the tourists out of those places, you'd have catastrophic poverty overnight. Dominican Republic was already a really, really poor country. Without the tourism industry, it would have very little economically going for it.
The same is for organic food.
Yes.
And buy local.
that devastates communities that ship a lot of produce and products long distances.
Yep.
But so if everyone went to the farmers market only, a lot of local stuff, communities in Mexico and Guatemala and all over.
And Chilean farmers and people in Thailand and stuff.
Devastated.
The other thing, by the way, is organic food takes more. Organic food and grow local actually is more energy intensive than actually delivering food grown commercially. These are really complicated things, right? But the interesting point is that we actually know the levers we can control. Imagine if the government of Canada said, we're going to put 100% tax on anybody's travel to a tourist destination. So in Mexico costing you $2,000, it's going to cost you $4,000. Would that have an impact on tourism? Like overnight, right? You'd lose thousands of people would not go. It's interesting we're having a debate about Kinder Morgan, but not that. You'd actually have more of an impact on environmental sustainability by doing those things. Anyway, these are very good questions. The whole question of what works is the essence of a public policy school. Absolutely the essence of a public policy school.
Just want to make a quick comment about, I just spent a year working on energy issues in a policy fellowship.
Yes.
One of the things I had to do was write a couple of op-eds. And when I wrote an op-ed calling out our luxury travel and things like that and how carbon taxes would affect that type of stuff, it was denied. I had to take some of those things out in order for it to be published.
Ooh.
In order for it to be something that they thought was publishable.
They being?
The Leader Post. So not even, yeah.
Because if you look at the advertising in the Leader Post, there's an awful lot of tourism ads in there, right? Yikes. Okay?
Just something that I feel that what people are talking about more is just having a national pharmacare program.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting one because the evidence on that, and I really like evidence. Not using evidence is kind of silly. The absence of a national pharmacy program really costs consumers and governments a huge amount of money. It actually makes an awful lot of sense. You'd have a big pushback from the pharmacare industry because they make money through diversity and competition and things of that sort. Of course, the Americans really hate the Canadian pharmacare industry. We have a huge, big industry. Winnipeg has all sorts of companies that actually sell American drugs into the United States. And you mail order drugs because they're so much cheaper. Generic drugs in Canada are way cheaper than the United States. You have people who go down to the Mexican border, go across into Mexico, buy the same drug for like 1/20th of what it costs in the United States. They do the same thing in Canada. They actually have buses that come into southern Ontario. People get on a bus trip and come across. Let's go on the drug trip over there. Come back and buy anything. No, just have my drugs with me. 87,000 capsules of something. Drug tourism, right? Which is interesting, by the way. We now actually have surgical tourism, where you can go into Cuba, you can go into Mexico, Taiwan. Thailand has become a really big country for this. Of when they get your kidney out. Actually, people are going to India and buying kidneys, which is really terrible. Anyway, pharmacare, great idea. Yeah, and when it's worked, it's worked. When it's been implemented, it's worked very well. So let's go back and we'll get on the first part of the economic development piece. So we'll attend part of today and part of next Tuesday, working through some of these things. One of the interesting points is around Aboriginal folks in terms of policy and policy development. There's a lot of uncertainty about whether Aboriginal people are interested in economic development. This is sort of a very blunt way of saying sort of the concern. And to put this in its sort of racial sort of elements or the racist sort of elements, it is this idea that Aboriginal folks are lazy, they don't want to work, they'll have nothing more than sitting at home and having the check come or going down to the office and pick up the monthly check. It's not true, but it actually makes sort of good public rhetoric about Aboriginal sort of people and their economy. But it actually goes back into the people's understandings of indigenous ways of looking after themselves in the past. Aboriginal folks have been traders for thousands of years. You have all sorts of evidence. If you look at sort of archaeological sites that show stuff from the Gulf of Mexico showing up in trading sites here in Saskatchewan. We have all sorts of stuff up and down the west coast, from Haida Gwaii all the way down into California and some further afield. We have stuff from the west coast that goes way into the interior. From Alaska Panhandle that actually showed up not only in the Yukon, in the interior of the Yukon, showed up in the Mackenzie Valley, right? So trading is actually sort of a human characteristic. Why is that? Because down here we catch a lot of salmon, and up over there you shoot a lot of moose. So we have salmon galore. If you give you some salmon, will you give us some moose, right? And that holds down to everything from, in pre-contact times, to everything from copper to other sort of metals that you could find to certain artifacts. People traded all the time. And Aboriginal folks, as a starting point, just make sure you get this out of the system, that the idea that Aboriginal people making a good living is as central to Aboriginal concepts of livelihood as it is to anybody else's. The Chinese like to make a living, the Japanese like to make, the Finns like to make, everybody likes to do that, right? And they have interesting concepts because a lot of the expectations are also based on cultural norms. So Aboriginal societies were not surplus societies. And you didn't go and trap 827 beaver because you could, because if you trapped that many, you had to move them around. And that's actually an awful lot of work, right? And so you trap what you need, you trap what you can trade, you go down and trade with other people, you get some supplies, but you don't stockpile things in enormous sort of volumes. In large part, that reflected their confidence that they could feed themselves. You know, didn't mean that the buffalo were always there on the right day, but if it wasn't the buffalo, you could shoot some geese. If it wasn't the geese, you could catch some gophers. If it wasn't gophers, you could shoot a deer. Right? There were always food supplies. There might be berries. There might be plants. Always things that you could eat around. And so the idea that Aboriginal folks lived on the verge of sort of constant starvation just is not true. But it's sort of convenient for non-Aboriginal people who wanted to take over their lands. And the logic behind terra nullius was the Aboriginal, that's the Australian phrase, the Aboriginal people weren't using it anyway. So since they weren't using it, we could farm on it. I always find the debates around environmental issues quite fascinating because of all the landscapes in Canada that have been transformed the most by European intrusion. We live in it here in Saskatchewan. It's prairie agriculture. If you actually think of what's happened to the landscape from what it was like before, the grasses are all gone. Those kind of regular fires we used to have that would come across and replenish the soil. The bison are gone. Most of the antelope are gone. There's still some deer there, but only because we can't get enough people out hunting them. We've actually transformed this landscape dramatically. Nobody ever gives farming a hard time. You give oil and gas a hard time, you give forestry a hard time, you give mining a hard time, but agriculture is benign, we think. Actually, it's changed ecosystems very, very dramatically. Aboriginal folks have always sought the opportunity to make a good living. And when you look at what happened when the fur trade came along, the fur trade was a chance to substitute things that you would do in a traditional way for a non-traditional way. So how would you cut down a tree before you had a metal axe? Any pre-contact indigenous tree cutter downers? How would you do it?
I know some ways they get cedar, but...
What's that? Tell us.
I'm familiar with... actually, it was quite sustainable. They wouldn't actually cut in some cases they would cut the entire tree down, but in a lot of cases, we would just remove planks one at a time, and the tree would remain alive. So they would, using whatever shells or rocks and other pieces of wood, they would separate, create like kind of an incision, and then start separating the plank from the cedar tree, and then they'd slowly work it up, and they'd get actually pretty awesome, like almost the equivalent of milled lumber through that practice.
So Quinn's living out near Prince Rupert in Terrace, BC. They have a thing there called a cedar tree that is one of the most remarkable trees ever created. A huge foundation of Indigenous life. You're absolutely right, Quinn, in what you're saying. Don't try the same thing with a pine tree from northern Saskatchewan. It'll take a long, long time. The trees in northern Saskatchewan are very dense because of the cold weather and slow growing season and stuff like that. But even what he was talking about shells and separating the wood, is that something you do in an afternoon? That's a very long, time-consuming process. And yes, we had flint rock axes that were developed early on, and all sorts of different sharpened rocks and things of that sort. Go and try it sometime. Go and cut down a tree using that sort of method. Sometimes you would actually just carve off you kind of circle around to sort of stop the sap from flowing, and the tree would actually fall over and die. That takes a lot of work. Get an axe, you go, and off it goes, and you start again. Same with boiling, like we talked before about metal pots, and we talked about manufactured clothing and knives and things of that sort. Guns are always a misleading one because we thought the Aboriginal folks really liked guns. They actually weren't very helpful until you actually had rifling. When you actually, in the 19th century, you actually, instead of having sort of balls, sort of round balls that were stuffed in, you actually had rifled bullets that were far more accurate. Until that time, the main use of rifles was actually against other human beings. They actually weren't very good for hunting animals. And the idea of Davy Crockett shooting the eye out of a grouse at 400 yards, not a chance. It isn't actually how it worked. But when you get rifling, it could be. You could actually be far more effective. So, keep in the back of your mind that the idea of indigenous people adapting to new economies at all times is just normal. When somebody comes along with a different kind of fishing line, they'll use a different fishing line. The Inuit were very good at this. The Europeans would arrive with telescopes. European first people came in, they would look at it from the window, and they go, I can actually see something, a seal, 800 yards away. So what did they do? They bought the telescope. And they started using a telescope all the time. It made life a lot easier and a lot safer and better and all that kind of stuff, right? So economic adaptation is an absolutely central part of sort of the indigenous economic sort of approach to economic activity. And they've been involved in sort of what we call the capitalist economy, the market economy, for a very, very long time. They wanted the things Europeans have. Interesting, what do they always say? Well, they bought trinkets and beads. The beads very often were actually how they made their money. Actually, they formed it into money, into wampum belts, and that was actually how they sort of did part of the exchange. You don't have anything I want right now, but if you give me a wampum belt, I'll take that. You can have the meat I have, and I'm going to come back later on and trade it back to you next year. So we have this really odd sort of idea that indigenous folks were sort of non-market oriented. And it doesn't mean they're the same as capitalists in Britain at that time, but then most of the people in Britain weren't the same as the capitalists in Britain at the time. These are evolving sort of arrangements. The Europeans discovered there's a way of creating demand. We talked about this before, bringing in alcohol and tobacco, that all of a sudden, this is something you should want, something that would be part of your lifestyle, and they did that, and they consumed it, sometimes to their detriment. But tobacco now has become a very big symbol of indigenous cultures. And if you go to if you're inviting an elder to give a talk at a conference or something like that, it's very appropriate to give them a gift of tobacco before you get started. Integrate these things in very easily and very, very quickly. Aboriginal folks were involved in agriculture. So the idea that Aboriginal people were not farmers is not right. First off, they were farmers in places like Southern Ontario. Secondly, even in areas where they cultivated in a wild form, things like wild rice. They knew where the food was. They could figure where the food was and harvest the food. But even with commercial agriculture, in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, we didn't have one or two examples of indigenous people who were making an adaptation to farming and whatever. We had hundreds of them. Lots of people were doing well at farming. The buffalo are dead. Buffalo are gone. People had to feed themselves. And they did what any other society would do. You'd find another way to feed yourself. You grow potatoes. You grow some wheat. You get involved in commercial agriculture. However, so comment would come up several times, that if you had a whole bunch of wheat, if you had a really good year, you had a bunch of surplus wheat, you could not sell your wheat until the Indian agent told you could sell it. And if the other farmers were saying, if the First Nations bring in 1,000 bushels of wheat, it's going to lower our prices, please don't let them bring it in right now, the Indian agents would often say that. Hold back on the Indian sale of, you can't sell this when you want to, you can sell it when we tell you that you want to do, we want to get involved. On the fisheries, particularly, not so much on the East Coast. The East Coast, the indigenous population was undercut very quickly. The Beothuk were actually exterminated on Newfoundland. But even in places like New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, there was a lot of indigenous involvement in the fishing industry. Not the offshore fishing industry, but sort of what's called the inshore. Inshore is where you actually have to go back into the harbor at nighttime, and you go out in the daytime and fish again. The Micmac were catching and selling eels. A lot. They're not something I'm particularly interested in, but they would catch them and sell them and make a big deal of money. On the West Coast, Aboriginal folks were really actively involved in the salmon industry. And one of the first major industries in British Columbia was harvesting salmon in the Fraser River and selling it in Hawaii. So what happens, the Hudson's Bay Company would buy salmon, they would dry it or salt it or pickle it or whatever in places like Fort Langley, British Columbia. They would box it up and they would take it down to Hawaii and sell it down there. And they'd bring goods from down there back up to North America and sell it in some sort of triangular and circular kinds of trades that actually work quite well. So the indigenous people early on, this is in the early part of the 19th century, were involved in the commercial fishery. The commercial fishery took off in the 1880s and 1890s. became a huge industry. It's where the depopulation of the salmon fishery started, was at that time period. A huge amount of overfishing, so they would overfish one river, then go to the next, and overfish that, and then go to the next, and make their way up. And Aboriginal people were an absolutely central part of the canning industry. If you go to the canning industry in Richmond, British Columbia, you'll see pictures of Aboriginal people from the area working in the salmon runs, right? And working as fishermen too. They owned their own boats. They went out and caught fish, and they did really, really well, all the way up the coast. Quinn will know this from being there around Prince Rupert, that First Nations people were very heavily involved in the fish industry up there, until somebody came along. Who came along and displaced them? Quinn, do you know? Wait for him to find that mute button. We'll see if Quinn knows at downtime. The answer actually was first the Japanese and then the Chinese. Asian workers came in. They would work under far more constrained circumstances. In a lot of cases, the Chinese were brought in as contract workers. So what would happen is a contractor, the same thing happened with Italians on the railways and Ukrainians on the railways and stuff like that. They would go over to China and they would say, I want to hire 40 people here to come over and be fishermen, or you work in fish canneries, and you can make a lot of money relative to what you can make in China. So all of you would agree to come. I'd take you back over there and you start working in a cannery. You'd be working under my direction. I was the sort of job boss. I would manage you on behalf of the cannery. Typically what I would also do is I would also charge you for the food and room and board that I gave you, which was really crappy, both crappy food and crappy room and board. And you might think you were going to get $200 a year to send home, and you got $30 a year to send home. But $30 a year was still twice what you made in China, and you could actually support your family reasonably well. So the Chinese workers were actually easier to control. The one problem with Aboriginal folks is they had to feed themselves. So they would actually take a break from working in the cannery to go and catch the salmon they needed to feed themselves for the winter. And it used to drive the cannery owners crazy, because they'd say, well, right in the middle of the season, we had half of our workers go off this week and half are going off next week. And how can you run a cannery this way? Well, the answer is bring in Chinese and Japanese workers and displace the other folks out of the sector. But it's kind of an interesting thing. These are industrial workers working in factory systems. These are canning operations, and these are carving up the salmon and cleaning them, whatever. Very standard sort of industrial kind of environment, and actually doing very, very well. But it didn't fit with their lifestyle so much. They found these other folks who were cheaper, easier to control, and so in fairly short order they got booted out of the sector. They also work very heavily First Nations in the forestry industry. We see lots of First Nations people going up as loggers, working in the forests, enjoying working in the forests, making actually really good money in that area. In other areas, in the sort of the resource area in particular, in infrastructure development, the Aboriginal folks generally were sort of in a support role. Didn't work in the mines as miners very often. Some did, not very many. But they actually worked in providing food, harvesting deer and moose and bringing it in to sell. They work as short-term construction workers. And most Aboriginal folks in this time period were interested in what I've described here as the mixed economy. And a mixed economy is simply an economy that allows people to meet their ultimate objectives in a culturally sustainable way. So it's really fascinating watching all the time when you see in the Yukon, for example, one of the things they hired Aboriginal people to do was to cut wood for the stern wheelers. You have riverboats going up and down the river, and you actually have to have cords and cords and cords of wood sitting on the side. You pull the riverboat comes in, stern wheeler comes in, loads up a whole bunch of wood and takes it away. Well, an awful lot of that was done by Aboriginal folks. But the one caveat the Aboriginal folks had was, I still want to have my regular lifestyle. I want to go hunting, I want to go fishing, I have to do ceremony. And so they were seen as, in quotation marks, unreliable. They worked when they wanted to, worked when they were able. And the interesting thing is they're not income maximizers. They weren't trying to make a whole bunch of money. They wanted a mixed economy. They loved hunting and fishing. It was still major part of their food and diet. So they created these mixed economies that actually, we see them showing up all across the country. They'd go and work in a canning plant in Nova Scotia for a couple of weeks a year. And they would make, in that process, pick a number, $100 in a couple of months. That's all the cash they needed. That's all the cash they really wanted. They weren't trying to make $400. They wanted to make $100. And on that basis, they could actually then go back and do the other things they wanted to do. And it's kind of interesting. We still have real trouble with that. And in fact, there's an awful lot of Aboriginal folks in Canada who are interested in the mixed economy. that would be a preferred way to live. And we have a couple of really good examples. So Syncrude was one of the biggest, and still is, a big part of the resource economy in Fort McMurray. And they were working with the Fort Chip community, and they sort of said, we want to hire a whole bunch of people. And we're having trouble because we hire your folks and they're unreliable. We'd fly up on Monday morning to pick them up, and we wanted to pick up, we were planning on getting 10 people, and only 5 of them showed up. So we had to fly a plane all the way back down, and only has 5 people in it. And so Syncrude sort of after a while sat down with the community and said, we really want to hire your folks. They're actually really good workers. They're reliable. They're in the north. We don't have to pay as much to get them to fly in from California, from Toronto, or from Vancouver. This is a preferred. So what are we doing wrong? And he said, well, you expect us to show up for work every week. And if my grandmother died, I have a week of ceremony. I don't have a choice. I can't not do that. If you look at in our, the regular system, you say, okay, you have, what do they call them, compassionate days. You can have 3 compassionate days. Well, actually, in an Aboriginal community, that's not enough. It's a longer commitment, and it's a multi-year commitment because you have to do ceremony later on as well. Interestingly, Japan has the same structures, and their corporate system actually accommodates that. Well, your grandmother died a year ago. Of course you're going to take today off. Try that in Canada. Go to Tim Hortons and say, I can't show up today. My grandmother died a year ago. That's your problem, not my problem, right? So what they did with Syncrude and Fort Chip was really nice. They actually said, what we want is Fort Chip said, well, what do you guys need? They said, well, we need 20 people a week. We'll pick them up on Monday morning and we'll fly them back on Friday. So we want to hire 20 people. The community said, well, don't hire 20 people, hire 40 people. We don't want 40 people. So, well, you want 20 people each week, right? We'll make sure there's 20 people every Monday. And the 20 people will fly down, work for a week, and come back on Friday. And next week, it might be a different group. It might be some of the same people, it might be different people, but we will make sure there's at least 20 there every Monday morning. And it worked out perfectly. And a little more money on training, had to train 40 people instead of training 20 people, but it actually worked really, really well. And the foundation of this was a mixed economy. So if you see tourism industry, big game hunting, big game fishing, which is very important employers of Aboriginal people in different parts of the country. Seasonal salmon fisheries industries now are becoming back into vogue in this way as well. So Aboriginal folks make things work by having a broader value system. So a huge system, importance on feeding themselves. I mentioned here about country food. Even now, in most northern areas, country food counts for between 30 and 40% of caloric intake over the course of a year. It's getting really hard in some places, like around Yellowknife. There's nothing to hunt anymore. The caribou have all disappeared. So you want to do it. You'd like to go up and kill 5 or 6 or 7 moose or caribou, but they aren't there. They're just disappeared off the face of the earth. But in many places, country food is still a big issue. The fellow I told you about this morning, whose reserve was sort of taken away from him and sort of thrown out the window, which is not a very nice way to do it. He still hunts for his community. So every year he goes up with his cousins and whatever, and they hunt 4 or 5 or 6 moose. They kill them, they clean them up, and they take them around and share them throughout the community. That's just how it's done. Same with fish, same with berries. So these not only remained a mixed economy, they remain a big part of a mixed economy, and they're a huge part of the overall sort of economic model. So when you hear people say that the average income in Old Crow is $25,000 a year, how do you possibly make a living on that? Well, I will admit it's tight, but actually they have lots of caribou, and they have lots of fish, and they have lots of muskrat, and they do a whole bunch of other things, and they actually can feed themselves relatively well based on the food supplies that they have in the area. And they do interesting things. Just to Old Crow as an example, muskrat you trap these and sell their pelts. And I don't know if they still do it, but when I was a kid, they used to close down the school during the ratting season. And you'd close down, and all the families would move out onto the Old Crow Flats, and they would go trapping muskrats in the spring, as the spring freeze up, and then they come back and go back to school and extend the school season into July, because that was their time that was most important for them. So just because Aboriginal folks didn't get into the commercial agriculture, commercial industry, government bureaucracy kind of jobs right off the bat, doesn't mean they weren't actively engaged in the broader economy, and they weren't actually very creatively engaged in the broader economy. So when the Alaska Highway was being built to Alaska, big surprise given the name, from Edmonton all the way up to Alaska, Aboriginal people were the guides. They actually helped them find the roads that they would use. And they did a whole bunch of other things like that. And the women would get involved very heavily in, they would make muklets and moccasins and other sort of clothes, which initially people bought as souvenirs. These, soldiers and construction workers were up there, and so I'm going to buy these for my family. And then they realized that in the wintertime they were far better off having Aboriginally made clothing than they were having U.S. Army clothing. I should say one really quick story because it sort of exemplifies the creativity. If you go up to the northern Mackenzie Valley, up around Inuvik, and you go west toward the Richardson Mountains, there's an area there where they had a Hudson's Bay Company trading post. And the idea of this trading post was to give you access to the Yukon. You had to climb over the Richardson Mountains and then get down into what's called the Porcupine River, and that would actually take you down to the Yukon River. And this was one of the best fur trading areas in the Hudson's Bay Company territories in the 1840s and 1850s. The only problem was you had to get all the supplies across from the fort, Peels River Fort. You had to cross over to the other side. Okay, so what did you do? Well, you hired Aboriginal folks. So when the canoes came in, you'd come in, and you had to pay a pretty high price because you had to march across and then climb up a hill and go way across the hill, come down the other side, and off you go. So they've been starting to do this in the 1840s, and it's a lot of work. Year after year, the canoes would arrive, Hudson's Bay Company canoes. They'd hire the local Aboriginal folks, and they'd make sort of a year's worth of money in a couple of weeks taking these supplies across. Then in the 1870s, for reasons that are a bit complicated, I won't bother with that part, a Hudson's Bay Company guy was told to, well, can there be an easier way across the mountains? Okay, because you're still going up around the hill and across and down the valleys, and it's, if you've ever been up in these places, in the summertime, if you get near any kind of swampy water, the mosquitoes are a little bit ferocious. They'll come and carry you off. They're just really, really bad mosquitoes. And when you have your black flies and oceums, have you ever been in these kind of environments? You sort of take a breath and they come in through your nose and your eyes and your ears. Oh, but now
that's where a lot of the reserves are located.
Sadly, that's absolutely true. On swampy water, right? Right near not on the dry land, but on the swampy land. Absolutely right. Anyway, so what happens, this guy goes up there and starts exploring around. And he discovered that if you actually, instead of stopping at this fur trade post, if you actually went up about another 5 kilometers by really gentle water, you got closer and closer to a place where the mountains, instead of being this high, were actually really low. And you only had a portage of about 400 yards to get from one watershed to the other. And for 30 years, they had hired Aboriginal folks to walk over the mountains, right? And every single Aboriginal person knew what was going on. And for 30 years, they didn't say a thing. And the Hudson's Bay Company paid and paid and paid and paid, right? And you can imagine, when the Hudson's Bay Company people were in the room and say, how stupid are these people? All they have to do is paddle a little bit further up. Remember Hudson's Bay Company guys not going very far away from the post? All one guy had to do is go hunting one weekend. Paddle, paddle, paddle up there. Ooh, level area, small height of land, 400-yard portage, down the other side. That would have been really smart. And for 30 years, they didn't do it. And I think you got to understand that happened thousands of times across the country. And that's just good business, right? You don't give away your commercial. You don't have to pay us. If you want to, you can just go up here and hire people. All you have to have is bring up one sort of dog sleds or horse or something like that, and you can carry this stuff across here in a minute. Not for 30 years. It's actually astonishing when you think about it that they got away with it in all that sort of time. The arrangements that I've talked about, the mixed economy, the fur trade arrangements, remained very much in place into the 1950s. And I keep reinforcing this because you need to understand, this is a matter of course, that when you talk to elders who are in their 80s, they remember that lifestyle. They lived that lifestyle. Being raised in Whitehorse, going to school in the 1960s, many of my high school friends had actually been born in tents. When they were 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 years old, they were actually living in tents, hunting, fishing, trapping, doing all that kind of stuff into the 50s and early 60s, right? So we're not talking here about something that's 300 years ago. This was a very good, very viable way of working with the economy, based largely on limited sort of material aspirations. They weren't trying to buy a 3,000 square foot house. They weren't trying to buy... Yes, please, go ahead.
I just wanted to add, my mom was born in the 40s, and as she got older, she said she started working when she was about 12 years old. And what they used to do was they used to go to the non-Indigenous farms, and they used to pick rocks to clear the field so they can do their farming. And as she got a little older, they went further south, like around Lethbridge area, and then they used to work in the sugar beet fields. So a lot of the Indigenous people used to do a lot of that, and then they used to go home in the fall time and do their harvesting. So from my mom said she never, there was not a day in her life where she never worked.
Yep. Absolutely. Excellent sort of comments. I mean, the sort of really challenges that idea of sort of, lazy Aboriginal folks, right? But also pick up this mobility factor. People used to come all the way from the area around Haida Gwaii, up here Prince Rupert, British Columbia, and come all the way down into what's now Seattle to trade. These kind of huge distances and huge mobility, working on all sorts of different jobs in different places. They'd work with prairie farmers. We heard about the sugar beets. This was commonplace. And they weren't looking for, they didn't want to be farmers, necessarily want to be full-time farmers. But that was the place they found work. They were temporary work in the forest industry, the mining sector, and things of that sort. So what happens? The fur trade collapsed after World War II. Collapsed really, really quickly. The villain in this piece was polyester. When they developed sort of synthetic-based, basically oil-based, clothing, all of a sudden the furs lost their character and their value. And the fur trade, the prices just, nobody did this on purpose. This wasn't because of any environmental movement. They just stopped buying them. And they had real trouble finding markets. They're now finding more markets. Russian oligarchs, it turns out, really love furs. And some of the North American furs are better than the Russian furs, so we're actually getting big markets developing again. We still have active markets. You can actually go and trade sort of real furs in the Robertsons in Lac Orange and L'Orange. You can actually go and there are lots of fur trading places in the country. Not as many of them people who are doing the fur trading as Aboriginal as you might think. There's a lot of non-Aboriginal fur trappers now in Canada. But the fur trade collapsed. And the interesting thing here was it collapsed at exactly the time the government was expanding social programs. So you lose one source of income, and the government, just entirely by happenstance, was there with another source. Remember we talked about Mother's Allowance? So the $5 a month from Mother's Allowance came in at precisely when the fur trade was collapsing. So all of a sudden, it becomes far more important. We really need to have this, we need this Mother's Allowance money. Then social payments and things came in, social transfers came in very quickly. And it's astonishing how quickly that dependence built up. Why? Because the same time period also saw a massive expansion of the resource economy. So you actually have, the government has more money. The government of Canada was flush in the 1950s. The government of Canada has this moral code that says, we went back to the questions we were asking before, very much worrying around, at a minimum, the equality of opportunity, but equally sort of a combination of 3 and 4, the equality of outcomes and avoiding abject poverty. So we're going to build Aboriginal people nice houses. We're going to give them a certain amount of money so they don't starve. We want to give them opportunity through education. So all these things happened all at once. We're here from the government and we're here to help you. Became sort of the mantra of the time. And the government expansion was extraordinarily fast. You went from communities that had never seen an Indian agent in the 1950s, maybe once every 2 years somebody would come by, police officer would come by every once in a while, to a situation where almost every community has an Indian agent in town. And they're handing out checks on a monthly basis or giving you chits to use at the local store. So government dependency picks up really fast through the 1960s. And interestingly, I made this point several times, when Aboriginal people started talking about modern treaties and about new self-government and things of that sort, their number one reason for doing so was breaking dependence on government. It was only a decade old. And they could already see the incredibly negative impact of relying on government transfer payments. And you just need to understand here as well, going back into the 1930s, you know the concept, we talked about the concept of deserving and undeserving poor. You ever heard those phrases used in public policy conversations? So what does it mean?
Undeserving poor is somebody who would be in poverty because of something beyond their control.
Yes.
Whereas an undeserving poor may be somebody who fell to addictions, and it's a result of their own thing. So because it was their decision, it's not our responsibility to help you. Right. Essentially, they're absolving themselves from responsibility because it was their own fault.
Right? Absolutely their own fault. Now, the thing about the deserving poor is that those not their own responsibility doesn't relate to economic forces. It relates to things like being handicapped, being physically disabled, right? Being a single mom with 7 children. So look at that and say, okay, you can't look after yourself. Being elderly, you can't look after yourself. So therefore, we're going to pay for some of this. The deserving poor, we have no problem accommodating. Give money to them or whatever. The undeserving poor is where the challenge came in. Brad, your face popped up. Did you want to say something? Oh, okay. No, it's okay. I just want to make sure. So what actually happens is, and just for a second, understand how ideological the social welfare system is. So when you went back into Winnipeg in 1930, Great Depression is on. People have lost their jobs. Like 34% of the people lost their, 37% at the peak of Canadians were unemployed. Okay? If you were employed during the Depression, times were really good. If you were unemployed, times were really, really bad. And so you're lost your job because of broad economic forces. Are you undeserving or deserving? Sorry? You're deserving poor, right? No, you're not. You're not. Because if you could work hard, you'd get ahead. Right? So you're not a deserving poor. Are you still physically able to go to work? So why aren't you working? Don't tell me there's no jobs. I go and find a job, create a job, get some work, do something, right? You understand?
This is my life.
I know, but you understand, right? You understand. So what was happening in Winnipeg was, if you wanted to get money out of the government because your family's hungry, you had to go down and say, I can't look after my family. They would send somebody out to your house and say, well, you have a piano. Yeah, but my wife is teaching my kids how to play. Sell it. Sell it, that's going to get you stuff for a month. Come back after the month and you still haven't got a job. You have to sell the stuff you have, right? And then they would say, all right, we're going to give you some money, but you have to work for it. And these horrible scenes in Winnipeg, where actually they laid off a whole bunch of members of the Winnipeg Symphony Orchestra. They didn't make very much money, but they laid them off and closed it down. And so you have these people who are, classical violinists who were sent out on what they call boondoggles. And the unions used to hate government doing real work. They didn't want these workers to do real work. So they actually in Winnipeg had situations where they go out and one day they dig a hole, and the next day they go out and they fill it back in again. And they had to work, right? Because you're deserving. You're undeserving. I'm going to give you money. Darn well you're going to work for it. And so you have these incredible scenes where one guy who was a manager, real fan of the symphony orchestra, was sitting there watching the lead violinist, the first violinist in the orchestra, sitting up there wrecking his hands with a shovel, digging a hole and filling it back in again. Why are they doing that? Because you don't want people to get away with things. In Winnipeg, in the middle of the Depression, they had special lines where you could actually drop in notes and report on your neighbors. They had ham last week. I thought you were supposed to be on unemployment or they're desperate on welfare. Where did they get the ham from? Well, somebody in their church gave it to them, but they're not supposed to have it. So understand that the social welfare system is ideologically driven. It's designed to make sure that you don't get used to living on the dole. Right? So you actually have to go in and grovel. And grovel. And the whole idea is we've had people starve to death rather than go in and grovel. They would usually draw the line of when their kids started to starve to death. But they themselves, they would suffer enormously. And the whole system is based on this ideology, right? And if you actually look at what happens when this program comes in for Aboriginal folks, they implement the same system. We don't want people ripping us off. We're not going to send them a check every month. They have to come in and they have to fill in a form saying, I can't look after my family. They have to report in and say, I can't look after myself. Or they have to come in and I would say, well, show us you've applied for jobs. I live in Fort Ware. I live in Fond du Lac. There's no jobs. There's nothing. No, you have to go and apply for jobs. You should be getting a training, get an education, do something like that to prove that you're trying. You're trying to better yourself. These are straightforward ideological sort of things. And they actually destroy your self-worth. Basically, you're being told month after month after month, you're lousy, can't look after yourself, can't look after your family, can't do this, can't do that, right? And interestingly, in Canada, if you look at unemployment insurance, the overwhelming majority of people who use unemployment insurance stay on for about 2 or 3 months. We don't have a bunch of people who are sitting there doing an unemployment lifestyle. There are some parts of the country where there are no jobs, or people who haven't got the skills necessary to get the jobs that are available. But that's actually a relatively small portion. People who used to make $80,000 a year will accept a job at $25,000 a year. They'll use up their benefits, they'll use up their unemployment insurance, but then they will go and get a job. Our system is designed to be harsh. So when you have situations where the fur trade economy has died, there's no other economic activity, you're an Aboriginal person in these small communities, what do? Well, you report every month to tell the people you can't look after your own kids. Guess what it does to your self-worth? And it makes it so you become dependent on this. So on the one hand, you've got food, you've got some money for food, money for shelter, the government provides you with a house, and every month the government tells you you're worthless. Are you worthless? Of course not. You might have real value in the community, you might be a hunter or a fisher, you might still be doing a lot of that kind of stuff, right? Sometimes you're using your money you're getting from the government to pay for the snowmobile gas and outboard motor gas so you can go hunting and fishing. But the whole idea is very intrusive. I'm going to throw an idea out, something they've tried in Australia. And it's not as simple as I described it, so don't jump on me and say it's not as simple as you describe it, because I know it's not as simple as I'm going to describe it. But if you look at an average Aboriginal community, and I'm sure there is a mythical average community, you would find that the government transfers in Canada and Australia add up to about $20,000 a person. So if you think people folks are getting rich off this kind of stuff, they're not, right? But $20,000, $40,000 for a family of 4 people, the $20,000 for the adults, not for the kids, plus some other benefits and all that kind of stuff for kids. You can actually survive reasonably well. So what they did with Australia was they said, instead of us running this program through our social services system with all these rules and regulations and processes, we're going to give $20,000 per adult to the local community, and for every unemployed adult. And the community can hire these folks to do whatever they want. You go from, you got to understand, I'm sure I may have told you this before, there are communities, Aboriginal communities in Canada have 90% unemployment rates. We're not talking here about, in Canada we have an 8% unemployment rate, or 9% unemployment rate. We're talking about 80, 90% unemployment rates. If you add in the people who stop looking for work to the ones who are officially unemployed, so they'll say that Northern Saskatchewan now has about a 25% unemployment rate. Nonsense. It's much higher than that. If people stop looking. So they shift off one list to the other. In the United States, they're really bragging about a 4% unemployment rate. Right? For the last 10 years, the number of people who are out of the workforce has been skyrocketing. You spend 4 years looking for a job, you take yourself out of the system, you're completely welfare dependent, and the government says, look, we've got a Donald Trump. We've got a 4%. Barack Obama did the same thing. Look at our unemployment rate's going down. Yeah, but you're out of the marketplace is going skyrocketing. The people aren't even looking for work anymore. You've destroyed their whole sense of aspiration. So in the Australian example, we're the chief and council here at the front. You folks who were previously unemployed, we sit down and say, we have a job for each one of you. Now, what are you going to do? Well, we're Aboriginal leaders, and we are going to give Aboriginal jobs. You 3 are now basically keepers of stories. You've been told by the elders that's the kind of person you are. Go and talk to the elders. And when the elders tell you stories that you're supposed to share with the kids, go and do it at school. Okay? Do you mind doing that for us? Instead of getting welfare, that's your job now. You're going to do that on a regular basis. You folks are actually fishermen. And you're going to go and fish for the elders. You're going to catch fish, and you're going to bring them back in, and you're going to give them back to the community, and you're going to do that, right? We over here, we've got some people, you're just going to keep the ground clear, the house clean. You're going to paint buildings, you're going to pick up garbage, you're going to do all these kinds of stuff, right? And that's the job we actually want you to do. The 2 of you are going to look after the elders because they're the most respected people. Not these folks who are taking their stories. Your job is to actually care for them. And so within yourselves, you've got 6 or 7 elders in the community. You are their caregivers. And you're to give them 8 hours a day of caregiving. And take them for walks and look after them and clean their houses and doing all that kind of stuff. Yesterday, you were all unemployed. Today, you all have jobs. Wasn't that easy? Now, in this process, take an example of the people even over here who are being assigned to be sort of storytellers. Kind of a neat job, right? And your job now, and by the way, if you don't do it, we're going to find out, right? And we're going to stop giving them money. If you don't do the collection of story stuff, you're cold biscuits. You're out there. You get no money anymore. We're allowed to do that. So you look at that and you think, actually, that makes you like university professors. Because in the dominant society, we pay people silly amounts of money to be university professors doing what? Collecting stories and sharing them with people. So that's a perfectly legitimate job. And it was a cultural job that people used to have in the olden days, so it's not a bad job. It's a real job, really substantial. So what's wrong with that model? From 90%, or let's make a smaller number, 65% unemployment to 100% employment just by snapping your fingers.
Well, it's contrary to every sort of societal value that we have in our modern capitalist Canadian economy. Employment, is, as I understand you're saying, is really almost an imaginary concept, and that's exacerbated in the northern communities. If the government wanted to, they could turn around and give everybody a job, instant 0% employment, but it doesn't really work that way.
Because we want Aboriginal folks to grovel. I mean, put it in really sharp terms, right? And the people who run these programs don't necessarily think that way. They're just implementing a program. They're told to do this, and you have to look for a job, you have to do this, you have to do that, right? But you're right. I mean, it is the value system of society that you look for a job. Anybody else find a problem with this program? Does it make sense?
Yeah, guaranteed annual income.
It's sort of like that, except a guaranteed annual income doesn't necessarily involve work. So guaranteed annual income means we're going to make sure that everybody gets $20,000 a year. And, Finland actually started a test. They just shut it down. Everybody's, watch, Finland's doing it. They're going to help this. That was $12,000 a year or something like that. Pretty low guaranteed annual income. They stopped it, and they said they're going to study it to see what the impact was. My guess is they won't go forward with it. Because the resistance to giving away money is really huge.
The well-being is good, but then economic development aspects, how much income are you getting in return?
You're getting $20,000. Remember, we get more because remember we're the council, so we actually have real jobs. Remember, and this community has 65% unemployment, and actually, so for you, you're all getting $20,000 a year. So you got a partner, they're getting $20,000, you got $40,000. Are you getting rich? No, you're not. Are you getting? Is it costing the government money? It saves the government money. We have no processing fees anymore. We have no application forms, right? But the interesting thing is because it's $20,000 a year, this guy's getting $65,000 a year, right? He's our finance officer, right? Pretty good, pretty smart. Went off to university, got a degree and all that kind of stuff, right? Do you want to keep your job or do you want to have his job? So you're going to aspire to getting a real job, aren't you? Because we aren't paying you so much. If I paid you $65,000 a year, would you want to have his job at $65,000 a year? Probably not. You're looking after the elders. It's kind of a fun job, right? But if we only paid you $20,000, the idea is that you'd still be looking for opportunities. But you'd be going to work on a regular basis. You'd be doing something of value. And look what happened. What would the impact be on the community of having storytellers over here, people who are fishing to feed the communities over here? The community looks pretty cute because you guys are doing a nice job. You've painted and cleaned up and do all that kind of stuff. And the elders, instead of being lonely and isolated, are being looked after properly. Do you have a better community or a worse community as a consequence? So why don't we do this?
I was going to say, and Jocelyn can correct me because she has connections to this community. In my past life, when I was a journalist, I did a really interesting story quite a few years ago about flying dust. And they actually got some funding to take people off welfare and get them working in a market garden. And they weren't really sure what was going to happen, but what they figured out was that for, essentially the same thing as, essentially the same income as social assistance, people showed up every single day. They worked in this huge, multi-acre garden. And then 2 years later, when the funding ran out for that program, they went into a year when they were trying to get funding again. And the people who then went back on social assistance, they came and showed up anyways. And actually, this was probably 5-6 years ago. I bought vegetables from that garden in Sobeys last summer. Quite happily.
Realistically, I think it comes down to leadership and what their values are. Because the market garden, they don't want to participate in it anymore. So they're doing everything they can to end it, right? So that doesn't make sense because you have 15 people it's been employing that has a passion about this market garden, but the leadership of the day, it's not sexy enough for their kind of business development focus they want. If they're taking social money and they're paying community members to start patrolling the community, well, that's not sexy enough. So, people oppose it. They don't see the value in that unless it meets kind of the mainstream ideal of what economic development is. But these very community-based initiatives, they're effective, but we as society have to value them and really understand the importance of them and lift up the values that they put back into communities. And it was my husband that supported. He was a chief. He supported the garden.
Yeah.
He got the Elders Lodge built. He went and built a partnership with Habitat for Humanity. He did. He had the community go in there and start patrolling their own community. He did a lot of little things like that, and people were intimidated by it for whatever, but they didn't vote him back in. And it was kind of like the Donald Trump, where he come and they just changed it all. You know, there was a lot of initiatives. The ones that they supported was the flare glass, you know, because that's the top kind of thing, but it has no really community benefit except it looks good in the paper, right? So that
it looks mainstream,
yeah,
right? And so the interesting thing here is that the social assistance economy is invisible. You don't really know what's going on. It's just people going in and getting their checks and whatever. We also underestimate seriously the social impact of social transfer payments. Social transfer payment for a couple of months is not a problem. I hope if you ever get in that situation, you never shy away from taking advantage of it. It's what it's there for. Unemployment insurance, social benefit, welfare when you need it. You know, we have a lot of people who suffer rather than just, they don't want to go through the indignity of going down and applying for work. And sometimes, I hope some of them are wonderful, sometimes you go into those offices and the people are really mean. They think it's their money. They make you feel really badly. What do you mean you're unemployed? Why don't you get a job? We got a job board over here. Go back one of those jobs. You know, and it is hard that way. I think the other side that Jocelyn's pointing out here, it is a huge thing about leadership. People want things to look like everybody else. And the interesting thing with the Australian one is it actually worked quite well. So they stopped it. You know, which is pretty much the same pattern, because these things get done, the government changed. So it was done initially as a Labour government, and a Liberal Democratic government came in, Liberal National government came in, more conservative, like the Sask Party kind of government. Well, we don't do that kind of stuff. That's socialism. We're going to cut that program. And many of the things, when you mentioned the Market Garden, you know, of course it was only a 3-year project. Of course it was grant-driven. And of course the grants dried up because governments get no benefit from saying grant was renewed. Instead, if they said, new grant for a glass factory, hey, that's a brand new thing. This is really exciting.
You know, the only thing that stood between the Market Garden from continuing growing economically was they needed a glass house, a greenhouse built.
The greenhouse.
Yeah, and the community, because of the new leadership, they didn't want to focus on that, so they just, because they don't see the value in it. Right?
And sometimes it's a question of the granting agencies changes priorities, and so now we're on renewable energy instead of greenhouses, and so what used to be a funding program disappears. So you sort of kind of see the absurdity of it, but the interesting piece here is that I always find very fascinating. We could solve this problem. What I've described is not as easy as you think, because it turns out that you guys don't trust the three of us. And in fact, these particular 3 people, remember we sent them fishing? It turns out that you had problems with them in high school, so actually they're on latrine duty. And their job is actually to clean all the toilets in the city, in the community, right? So are you guys happier now? Fishing was okay. Cleaning latrines, toilets, not such a big deal. You know, so then it comes back on us, and we're using this money. You know, so it's not easy. I would try to make it sound as easy as possible to let you know now it's not as easy as possible. But there are variations on this. There are partial sort of opportunities and everything else. But instead, what happens is we have so many different programs: education program, training program, retraining program, social service program, you know, drug alcohol rehabilitation programs, 50 different programs. And we have a huge bureaucracy running each one of those things, which actually takes money away from the communities. So anyway, just to finish up really, really quickly. The other sort of thing I want to end with here is this, what I call the poverty amidst plenty. Aboriginal folks in the fur trading areas in the northern 3/4 of the country were actually doing relatively well into the 50s and 60s, as I've said about 9 times now. I want to reinforce that over and over again. People were living on the land. They were feeding themselves. Did they have a lifestyle that looked like downtown Toronto? Not at all. Did they want the lifestyle that looked like downtown Toronto? Not at all. Were they comfortable, happy with their life expectancy increasing? Yes, it was. Anti-tuberculosis measures were being effective. Healthcare systems were being provided. They even had some schooling going on. That was actually, so things were actually looking like they were coming together. Where things got a bit complicated, in some very major ways, was this period in the 60s and beyond, what called poverty amidst plenty. After World War II, there was a massive boom in the resource sector. hundreds of mines opened up across the country. Roads were built. You can take a look at a map from 1940 and compare that to the map from 1970, and you will see roads all over the place, and railways being built, and airports being built, company towns springing up. In the 1960s, almost every year there was a new company town being built. Some of them were huge. Places like Shefferville in northern Quebec, Labrador City, towns with 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 people. Clinton Creek. Clinton Creek was one of the just on the other side of Dawson City. It's gone now. You go there, all you can find is about 3 or 4 pieces of concrete that used to be the foundation of some of their processing mills. They actually lifted up all the houses and moved all the houses to Dawson City. They moved them all away. Cassiar Asbestos, one of the most popular places to live in a mining town in Canada, right smack in the middle of the Cassiar Mountains, just south of Watson Lake. Beautiful area, fantastic, world-class hunting and fishing everywhere you go. Really tight-knit town. People loved living there. You actually go and see them online. They've actually one of the first sort of surviving online communities. They sort of stayed together. They closed the whole thing down. They had to because the mine was all finished. They took all the asbestos ore out of there. But it was a really great company town. The Aboriginal folks around there had none of it. Right? So this is Uranium City. They were building these towns, building these resources. Sometimes people got part-time jobs. Occasionally people got full-time jobs. Sometimes they got service sector work and, with delivering gasoline or something like that. But Aboriginal people did not participate in these projects in a major way. And you end up with, because of the company town environment, you have Aboriginal communities that were perfectly fine living in log cabins, perfectly fine living a traditional lifestyle. They had a good life. And very, very quickly, all of a sudden you have people with panaboat homes. They have nice houses and they have swimming pools and they have gymnasia and proper schools and health centers and all that sort of thing. And you actually end up seeing how you see the gap all of a sudden. Before you didn't see the gap. You might know of the gap. You go down to Vancouver. I don't want to live here, but at least you can see the big houses and stuff. Now they're now they're next door to you, and you end up with this huge divide growing between the Indigenous and non-Indigenous activity. You also then see a government stepping in with more programs. They're going to do. Government agencies are going to set up economic development programs. Now there's a really good idea. Civil servants who have job security, secure incomes, and have never done anything entrepreneurial in their whole life will actually now start Indigenous entrepreneurship programs. There were some people who did this extremely well. They're honest, honorable people. Even the ones who didn't do it well were honest, honorable people. But do you really want to go to a government employee and have them help you set up a business? So I was asked one time, many years ago, to do a review of government programs for Aboriginal business development in Yukon. Right? So Yukon federal and territorial programs. So I went up to Whitehorse and I went around and I discovered there were 75. Remember how big the Yukon is, right? 7,000 First Nations. There were 75 separate programs that Aboriginal people could apply for Aboriginal economic development. 75 programs. This is insane. So the government of Yukon said, this is insane. So we're going to create a one-stop shop. And we're going to have a single application form, and we're going to make the programs invisible. So you fill out your application form, and my job as a civil servant was to say, okay, he's applied for money to buy a pickup truck to sort of cut down some firewood. Which one of our programs works for that? We have a small business development loan program, and it provides loans of up to $10,000, and he's applied for 5. I can figure that out and do it. So the one-stop shop in Yukon actually only administered 25 out of 75 programs. So it was one stop plus 50 stops in order to figure it out. So I went in to see some people in the federal government agency, and I said, I'm just here to sort of see how you do these programs and how people apply for the programs. Very defensive. They were right, well, you're an academic, you're up here to make me, embarrass me and stuff. I said, well, I just want to find out what's going on. So she came over with a binder, bigger than this, and said, fill in this application form. So I'm flipping through it and going, you're joking, right? I have a university professor with a PhD. I don't want to fill in a stupid form. It's page after page after. And they said, and it was very complicated. What's your estimate? What's your advertising thing? What are your annual revenues going to be? And remember, these are almost all small business loans. These are almost all, I want to hire and get a boat so I can take people fishing in the summertime. And they said, well, no, hold on. Don't be upset. These two people over here, it's their job to fill in your form for you. So the only job creation that was being done was actually creating jobs for non-Aboriginal people to fill in the forms that Aboriginal governments wanted done so you could tell them they could either have money or not have money. Right? Completely unnecessary. Because one of the things about, remember the flip side of the politics of smallness? The interesting thing about that is when somebody walked into a government office, the people in the room knew them. So one person walks in and says, I need $5,000 for a truck. Yeah, I'll stamp that. I know you. We went to school together. You're a good, honest, hardworking guy. Somebody else walks in and says, oh, you're not a good, hardworking person. I'm not going to stamp yours. Go back and get a partnership with a smart friend and work on it with them. Now, you can't do that. You got to fill in the forms. And have a non-Aboriginal person fill in the forms for you. So you get stuck in the absurdity of economic development. And one of the things that they did in one community up north was they had a co-op that was set up to sell Aboriginal handicrafts. There should be a global market for Aboriginal handicrafts. You see stuff coming out of northern Saskatchewan, really neat mucklucks and moccasins and things like that. You can't charge what they do. You should charge $400 for a pair of mucklucks. You can probably get away with charging $120, which means that you're getting paid about $1.50 an hour. I mean, this is not very much at all. But they created a co-op, and all the Aboriginal women in particular were selling into this co-op on a systematic basis. It was really, really interesting, and they're doing quite well. And they had a storefront in Whitehurst, and so they applied for a grant. God, don't apply for grants. And the government had to come up and assess and evaluate them. They said, well, you got a good business here. They wanted a grant to sort of do more marketing and more outreach, but you actually needed more product lines. Well, we just get what the people give us. They make mucklucks and this. Well, we got a great idea. You should actually make parkas. Because Yukon's a really good place for making clothing, because it's much cheaper than Bangladesh and all these other kind of places, right? And Bangladesh produces about a third of the world's clothing. China's about a third. These are places that produce it very cheaply. So they said, well, we're going to give you money to hire a non-Aboriginal person to come and manage this, and we're going to give you $750,000 to buy the machinery, so you can build a huge big factory. Then you can employ a whole bunch more Aboriginal people. And you want to guess what happened? The whole thing went broke. Not just the factory, the parka part, they lost the whole co-op. Everything went down. Because these civil servants thought this was a much better idea than actually just selling handicrafts. And ironically, if they'd held on 10 more years, they would have started getting the German and Japanese tourists. They actually would have made a lot of money. So the model is just silly. Of government people coming in and telling Aboriginal people what kind of businesses to set up, but that's part of you go there. Two last observations to end up. Mackenzie Valley Pipeline was really critical in turning people's sort of attitudes and assumptions about what went on in terms of economic development. The Mackenzie Valley Pipeline is interesting. The Berger report, they always say Berger recommended against the pipeline. Berger did not recommend against the pipeline. He recommended the pipeline be postponed for about 10 years till Aboriginal people were ready for it. It turned out they weren't ready for good reasons for about 20 to 25 years. And when they were ready, they were really ready. And we've actually now seen a lot of it. We're going to go back and talk about this next week. A lot of Indigenous people sort of getting involved in resource economy and sector. The value of the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline Inquiry, Thomas Berger, when they all have inquiries in Canada, what happens is we usually have meetings in Ottawa, Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, a couple of other places. Berger said, we're going to go up north. And he actually went down the Mackenzie Valley. He had television reporters with him. Every night in the news, they would show Aboriginal people sitting there talking about why we don't want the pipeline. Now, there's an interesting process of Aboriginal folks who wanted the pipeline didn't get as much chance to speak as those who opposed the pipeline. That's just normal sort of community politics. But what was really fascinating was non-Aboriginal Canadians really for the first time saw really traditional Aboriginal people talking about their own economic values and often speaking in their own language. And there were lots of folks I didn't know people still spoke Aboriginal languages. And they have an elder, in this case, somebody who's like 45, speaking in Dene. And they go, well, they have a translator going, and it shows up on the national news. Whit Fraser was actually assigned to this project. Whit Fraser used to be a very prominent sort of Canadian reporter. And at the end of the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline Inquiry, he felt so strongly about what he'd heard that he actually insisted on giving testimony, which you're not supposed to do as a reporter. You're not supposed to become the story. But he said, I have listened to all these things, and his main point, he's a really nice guy, he said, I listened to what the Aboriginal folks said. I listened to what the company said, in the business community said, and he said, they were so far apart, it was clear they'd never spoken to each other. And from his point of view, he said, the problem here isn't a pipeline or not a pipeline. The problem is Indigenous and non-Indigenous people have no idea of what each other wants. And if you pick the one success in the North in the last sort of 25 years, it's been they now understand what each other wants. It's an interesting process. The last story is simply James Bay Cree. James Bay Cree signed a modern treaty in 1975, the first of the real modern treaties in northern Canada. It involved the development of hydro development in northern Quebec, and these are massive, huge, big projects worth hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. They basically funded Quebec's sort of aspirations of independence and sovereignty, or sovereignty association. Billy Diamond was the chief of the James Bay Cree. Anybody heard the name Billy Diamond before? What do you know about him? Just that he was the chief of the James Bay Cree?
I know he didn't name the jam after me because I was up there this past year.
What Billy Diamond's interesting thing was, he was a very charismatic guy, very enthusiastic, charismatic guy. And he basically said, we're doing the land claims deal so we can build companies that will actually give our people an economic future. One of the first things they did was they built a canoe factory. He said, don't you think people would want to buy canoes that were made on the shores of Hudson Bay? And as a marketing device, that's actually a really good device. I don't think the canoe factory survived. They had a whole bunch of other businesses, got really involved. Billy Diamond, as an individual leader, did a huge amount starting in the mid-1970s to change the public attitude about what Indigenous peoples were capable of doing and what they wanted to do. And he opened up the world, Canada, to the idea that Indigenous people really wanted to be entrepreneurial in nature. And you look at the James Bay Cree, they are enormously successful on the economic front. They're not perfectly successful because they work in a northern environment with small populations, problems with capacity, getting the right kind of people to work in the area. But they own airlines and they own hotels, and if you went up there, you probably stayed in 14 businesses owned by the James Bay Cree, right?
It's actually a funny story. We flew in and flew out on the same day because we were on Metro Quebec's dime, and they literally never spoke of the Indigenous people the whole time, and nobody worked at. There was no Indigenous people working in the hydro converter, like in the station, at all. At one point, they drove by and they're like, and that's where Chesapeake is, and they were like, can we go there? And he's like, no time today, and talked about like Quebec economic imperialism the whole time.
Okay. So you saw a very limited slice. You didn't hear about the rest of it. So James Bay Cree are actually evangelists for Aboriginal economic development. They spend a lot of time going around and helping other communities set up businesses and development corporations and sort of showing this kind of model works. So the purpose for today was to get sort of as far as we sort of see the takeoff of Aboriginal economic development. And I'll just end by saying Aboriginal business development is one of the fastest growing sectors, if not the fastest growing sector of the Canadian economy. There's a lot of involvement in the resource sector. There's a lot of opposition to the resource sector. We'll come back to that a bit. But we are starting to see the development on a national scale. So I think we just lost our friends. Did you guys just disappear?
No, we're good.
Oh,
I'm
you're
here.
still there. Okay, well, you disappeared visually.
Still here.
Anyway, sorry this morning. We'll make sure it isn't a problem for Monday. Apologies for that. Have a great weekend. You guys are so paranoid.
Thanks.
There is no class on Monday. Do not show up on Monday. Do show up on Tuesday. What's that? Yes. I wasn't going to give you the whole weekend off. And I'll go find that template. The policy template. Thanks, everybody. Have a good weekend. Thanks, WebExers.
Thanks. Bye.